Let me paint you a picture. You're in an Imperial Palace competition. 23 candidates, only one winner. The stakes are literally your entire future. Common sense says, keep your head down. Don't make waves. Definitely don't get romantically involved with anyone. So naturally, I started hooking up with a stranger in the palace gardens. I know. But in my defense, and I'm just saying, he was very attractive. And he actually listened when I talked. And after spending all day with candidates who think I'm provincial trash, it was nice to have someone look at me like I was, I don't know, human? So we're having these romantic midnight meetings, right? He's quoting poetry, I'm sharing my deepest fears, we're doing the whole stolen kisses in the shadows thing. Very romantic, very dangerous, very stupid given that I'm supposed to be competing for Imperial Consort and not getting distracted. But whatever. I'm living my best life. I'm like, this is fine, this is manageable, it's just a garden romance with a palace official or whatever. And then I find out he's the emperor. Not a guard, not an official, not even a high-ranking nobleman. The emperor. The guy judging this entire competition. The guy married to the woman who's secretly my sponsor. The guy who could literally have me executed for the things we've been doing behind flowering vines. So that's great. That's fine. Everything's fine. Everything is not fine. Because now I have to figure out if his feelings are real or if this is some weird political test. Continue competing while knowing the emperor has seen me very informally. Work with the empress, who is definitely aware her husband and I are involved, not completely combust from mortification. And the best part? The absolute cherry on top? When he finally tells me the truth, you know what he says? I wanted to know the real you without the performance. My guy, you could have just introduced yourself honestly. Instead, we have this whole, I lied about my identity, but my feelings are genuine situation. Which is, I cannot stress this enough, totally ridiculous, but also kind of hot. I'm a mess, this story is a mess, but it's my mess, and honestly, totally worth it. My name is Aseret, and this story is how I got a second chance in life.
Welcome to the Portal Library. Step through and let the magic begin. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment if you'd love more stories or have a request. New videos uploaded every Friday.
A Second Chance, a BL short story. Along the life-giving waters of the Anu River, in an empire where pharaohs once claimed descent from the sun itself, the nation of Tamet-Heru has endured through shifting dynasties and unchanging traditions. Here, white limestone palaces tower over markets fragrant with incense and spice. Here, priests invoke blessings from Horus and Maat, while nobles scheme in columned halls. Here, power flows not from the sword alone, but from blood, alliance, and the careful navigation of hierarchies as ancient as the river itself. It is into this world, beautiful, brutal, and bound by tradition, a world where one soul has been given the rarest of gifts. Chapter 1. The Broken Promise. The dining hall was silent, except for the soft scrape of Aseret's knife against his plate. He sat alone at a table built for 12. Lotus blossoms floated in the centerpiece bowl, their petals beginning to curl inward, indicating that no one had changed the water in days. The evening light filtered through the high windows, catching the gold leaf on the painted columns. Everything in the house of Akam was designed to impress. Even the silence felt oppressive. Aseret cut a piece of roasted duck, chewed and swallowed in practiced motion, without tasting anything. Across from him, Jalen's chair, his husband, sat empty. Again, a young servant approached, eyes downcast, and refilled Aseret's cup with watered wine, without uttering a word to him. None of the workers spoke to him anymore, not unless he asked a direct question, and even then they would barely and reluctantly answer, so he stopped asking. Thank you, Aseret said quietly. She nodded and retreated. He watched her go, then looked back at his plate. The food was excellent. It was always excellent. The house employed the best cooks in the outer capital, imported spices from the southern trade routes, and kept a garden of herbs that required 3 full-time gardeners. Jalen's family prided itself on refinement. Aseret set down his knife. After a couple bites, he no longer felt hungry. He stood, nodded to the remaining servant by the door, and left the hall. His footsteps echoed on the limestone floor. The murals along the corridor depicted Jalen's grandfather leading troops into battle, spears raised, enemies fleeing, the family flag flying high. Sadly, Aseret's own family had no murals depicting heroic tales. Aseret's room was in the east wing, far from the main quarters. It had been chosen for him when he'd first arrived, so you'll have privacy, Jalen's mother had said, smiling. He'd believed her then. He thought that privacy meant they were considerate of his position and wanted him to be comfortable. But now he understood, that they only wanted to distance themselves from him. He pushed open the door, entering his room. The room had beautiful painted walls, a low bed with linen sheets, a writing desk near the window, and a carved chest for his clothes. A cage with songbirds sat in the corner. Jalen had given them to him during their first year of marriage, so you won't feel alone, he'd said, but the birds had stopped singing months ago. Aseret walked to the window and looked out over the estate grounds. Lanterns were being lit along the pathways. Somewhere in the main wing he could hear music and laughter, which meant that Jalen was likely there. Aseret leaned his forehead against the cool stone of the window frame. He tried to remember when it had all started to go wrong. I had been 24 when my father told me about the engagement. We'd been standing in the courtyard of our small estate, the holdings of Henan, a modest house 3 days south of the capital. The air smelled like sun-baked earth and the faint sweetness of overripe dates from the grove near the grain silos. My mother had been directing workers in a storage of the harvest, her voice carrying across the yard in sharp, efficient commands. A marquise's son? I had repeated, not quite believing it. My father Catherine, a man whose face was weathered from years of managing land that barely stayed profitable, nodded. The House of Akam and Jalen is their second son. But why us? I asked. At the time, my father's expression had been difficult to read while he replied. They want an alliance with someone outside the capital's inner circles, someone less entangled in court politics. He'd hesitated. It's a good match, Aseret, better than we could have hoped for. My mother's Senate had joined us then, wiping her hands on her linen wrap. She'd smile, something she didn't do often these days, and said, You'll be provided for and protected. The House of Akam has influence, Aseret. This is an opportunity that you should not miss. It's a way to ensure the prosperity of our family. I felt a flutter of something in my chest, something like excitement and hope. What's he like? I asked. I've only met him once, my father had said. He seemed polite and well-educated. He's 2 years older than you. That had been enough to have me starting imagining myself and my new life partner in a big city. A partner who saw me as more than just a barren son from a forgettable corner of the province. A partner who chose me. The engagement had been finalized a month later. Flashback. The wedding 1 year later. The ceremony had been held at the House of Akam. Aseret remembered the lotus ponds, the musicians playing in the courtyard, the priest invoking Hathor's blessing over their union. Jalen had worn white linen edged in gold thread. He'd smiled when they'd exchanged vows. Afterward at the feast, Jalen leaned close and murmured, You look nervous. Aseret laughed, embarrassed and uncertain. I've never been to something like this, he said. You'll get used to it. Jalen had touched his hand briefly while replying. I'm glad you're here. Aseret had believed it and was overjoyed to finally have met the one. Something did not feel right, even during their supposed honeymoon phase as newlyweds. It had been small things at first. Jalen correcting Aseret's posture during a formal dinner. Shoulders back, Aseret. You're slouching. Jalen redirecting a conversation when Aseret offered an opinion on trade policy. What my husband means to say is, Jalen suggesting he stay home when the family attended a regional assembly. I'm afraid you'd be bored to death. Don't concern yourself with those issues. Aseret had told himself it was guidance and love. Jalen knew the capital, knew how to navigate high society. And, of course, he'd want to protect him and keep him safe. But then there was the dinner party incident, a gathering of marquis-level families and a few lower-ranking dukes. Aseret had been seated beside Jalen, trying to follow the rapid back and forth of political gossip. Someone had asked Aseret a question, something about agricultural yields in the southern provinces, a topic he actually knew, and he'd started to answer. Jalen laughed, a loud, indulgent laugh. Aseret's still learning how things work in the capital, Jalen had said, cutting him off mid-sentence. He's from a rural holding with very different concerns out there. He patted Aseret's hand. Don't worry, darling. You'll catch up. It was awkward for a few seconds, but eventually the conversation moved on. Aseret had sat there, his face burning, and said nothing for the rest of the evening. The affairs had started, or maybe they'd always been there, and Aseret had just finally noticed. A servant had mentioned, casually, that the young master had stayed overnight at a friend's estate in the inner capital. Again. Aseret had asked Jalen about it the next morning. I stayed at Marinray's villa, Jalen had said, not looking up from the correspondence he was reading. We were discussing a business arrangement, and it got late. You didn't send word, so I was worried that something happened to you, Aseret pleaded. I didn't think I needed to. Jalen had glanced at him then, frowning slightly. Is something wrong? Aseret had hesitated. No, I was just worried and wanted to know your whereabout. Well, now you know, Jalen said shortly and returned to his letters. The next time it was a different friend, then another. Then it stopped being friends at all, and just became vague mentions of obligations and appointments that kept Jalen away for days at a time. Aseret had started hearing the gossip from the servants, whispers about a merchant's daughter, then a minor noble's son, Then someone else. No one ever said it to Aseret directly, but they didn't have to. Aseret had tried to confront him on multiple occasions. One late evening, Jalen had just returned from another, quote, appointment, his linen tunic wrinkled, his hair slightly disheveled. He was smiling ear to ear, relaxed and more at ease than Aseret had seen him in months. Jalen, Aseret had said, stepping into the corridor before Jalen could disappear into his private chambers. Can we talk? Jalen had paused, his expression shifting to mild annoyance. Now? I'm tired, Aseret. It's important, Aseret insisted. Jalen had sighed, but he'd followed Aseret into the small sitting room off the main hall. He'd remained standing. What is it? He said impatiently. Aseret had rehearsed this talk and planned what to say, how to say it, but standing there, looking at Jalen's impatient face. All the words had tangled in his throat. I feel like we barely talk to each other anymore. Jalen blinked. We're talking now, aren't we? I mean really talk. About us, about… Aseret swallowed. About where you go, who you're with. Jalen's expression hardened. Are you accusing me of something? He said defensively. No, Aseret had forced himself to continue. I hear things. People talk, and I feel like I'm not part of your life anymore. Like I'm just here doing nothing and feeling helpless. Jalen had studied him for a long moment. Then he'd sighed again, this time softer, almost pitying. Aseret, he said gently, stepping closer. You're tired. You're overthinking things. He'd placed a hand on Aseret's shoulder in a soft, reassuring touch. I have responsibilities, you know, and obligations. That doesn't mean I don't care about you. But, Aseret attempted to interject, you're working yourself up over nothing. Jalen's hand tightened slightly, just enough to feel like a dismissal. Go rest. We'll talk in the morning. He'd left before Aseret could respond. They never talked in the morning. Present, Aseret stood at the window, the memories sitting heavy in his chest. He'd stopped trying after that, stopped asking where Jalen went, and stopped expecting him at dinner. Aseret no longer voiced his opinions at gatherings, because it was easier to stay quiet than to be corrected. He'd written to his parents once, via a carefully crafted letter that only said he was doing well. The house is beautiful. I hope the harvest was good this year. His mother had written back, we're so proud of you. The alliance has already brought us favor. Don't worry about us. Just focus on your duties, his mother had replied. Aseret knew that he couldn't go back. His family needed this marriage, the connection, the status, and the political protection. If he complained, if he made trouble, it would reflect poorly on them. Worse, it might anger the House of Akum. His parents had worked too hard to secure this match, and he couldn't ruin it for them. Aseret stopped attending social events. Jalen didn't ask him why, and just ignored him. He stopped joining the family for meals, and no one came to find him. He spent his days in his room, or walking the estate gardens, avoiding the areas where guests gathered. The servants grew quieter around him, as if he were a ghost they weren't quite sure how to acknowledge. He stopped sleeping well. When he did sleep, he dreamed about his homeland, of the small courtyard, the smell of grain dust, his mother's voice calling him for dinner. He'd woke up in the beautiful room with the silent birds and felt hollow. He started getting sick. At first it was a relentless cough, then came the fever. The house physician was called, an older man with steady hands and a professional demeanor. He prescribed rest, herbal infusions, and cool compresses. Aseret followed the instructions, but the fever didn't break. Jalen visited him once. He stood in the doorway, keeping his distance. The physician says, you'll recover, he said quickly. Aseret, too weak to sit up, had simply nodded. Good, rest then. Jalen had hesitated, as if searching for something else to say. Then he turned and left. That was the last time Aseret saw him. Aseret never got better. The fever and the coughs worsened. Aseret drifted in and out of consciousness. Servants came and went, changing the compresses, offering sips of water. Their faces blurred together. At some point, the physician stopped coming, and the room grew quieter. Aseret's last clear thought was simple, almost distant. If I had chosen differently, would it have mattered? There was a long silent period where Aseret just felt at peace. Then there was this blinding light that left as suddenly as he came. Aseret gasped, his chest heaving, his hands clutching at linen sheets. The room felt very familiar. He blinked, his vision swimming, and realized he was in his childhood room. The small desk by the window, the woven reed mat on the floor, the wooden chest with the chipped corner that his father had always meant to repair. Aseret sat up, his heart hammering. He looked down at his hands. They were smaller, smoother, and much younger than he remembered. He scrambled out of bed, crossed to the small bronze mirror on the desk, and stared. A young man's face stared back. 18, maybe 19 years old, his younger face. Aseret's breath came in short, sharp bursts. He turned, wild-eyed, and saw the doorway. His mother appeared, carrying a basket of linens. She paused when she saw him. Aseret, are you all right? You look pale. Aseret opened his mouth, then closed it. He repeated the motion multiple times, but nothing came out. What? His voice cracked. He swallowed, tried again. What day is it? Senet frowned, concerned in her eyes. She sat the basket down and walked towards him, pressing a hand to his forehead. No fever, she said. Did you have a bad dream? Mother, he grabbed her wrist, desperate. What year is it? She pulled back slightly, startled. What kind of question? She started saying, then relented, as she saw the serious look on his face. It's the 14th year of Pharaoh Amenru's reign. Aseret, what's wrong? 14th year, so just 4 years before the engagement. Aseret let go of her wrist. He stared at her, at the room, at his own hands. Nothing, he whispered. I'm fine. Senet didn't look convinced, but she squeezed his shoulder. All right. Come down when you're ready. Breakfast is waiting. She took a long look at him before she left. Aseret stood alone in the middle of the room, his mind racing. I remembered dying. I felt it. I remember every second. Was it just a dream? He looked down at his hands again, flexing his fingers. For a long moment, he just stood there, breathing. And then, slowly, a single thought crystallized. I won't make the same mistake twice. Chapter 2. Resolve. I spent the rest of that morning testing the boundaries of what I remembered versus what I was seeing. After my mother left, I stood in my childhood room for several minutes, trying to organize my racing thoughts into something coherent. The logical part of my mind kept offering explanations that I desperately wanted to believe in. Perhaps this was a vivid dream, or maybe I had somehow slipped into a parallel world where events unfolded differently. Perhaps the fever had damaged my mind, and these memories of Jalen and the House of Akam were nothing more than elaborate hallucinations. But the details were too precise and too painful to be anything other than real memories. I walked to my writing desk and opened the small drawer where I'd always kept my personal items. Inside, I found the smooth river stone I'd collected when I was 10, the one with a white line running through its center that I'd thought looked like lightning. My father had told me to throw it away because it served no practical purpose, but I'd hidden it instead. In my previous life, I kept this stone until I was 14, when my mother had finally discovered it during a cleaning day and tossed it out. The stone sat in my palm now, solid and real, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had 4 years before my mother would find it again. I placed it back in the drawer and moved to the wooden chest in the corner. I lifted the lid and found my clothes neatly folded inside, each piece familiar and worn in ways I remembered from my childhood. The blue linen tunic, with a small tear near the hem that my mother had mended with slightly darker thread, was right where it should be. I'd worn that tunic until I outgrew it 2 years from now, or 2 years from when this moment was supposed to happen naturally. My head ached, trying to reconcile the timeline. I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my room and recognized the pattern immediately. My father walked with a slight favor to his left leg, an old injury from his youth that he never spoke about. The sound of his approach had always been distinct, and hearing it now, after years of absence, made my throat tighten with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Baron Catherine appeared in my doorway, his weathered face creased with concern. Your mother said you were asking strange questions this morning, he said, studying me with the careful attention he usually reserved for inspecting the grain stores. Are you feeling unwell? I forced myself to meet his eyes and adopt a casual tone that I hoped sounded convincing. I had a strange dream last night, and it left me disoriented when I woke up, I explained, which was technically true, even if it vastly understated the situation. I'm sorry if I worried Mother. I feel better now. My father's expression softened slightly, though the concern didn't entirely leave his features. Dreams can be powerful things, he acknowledged, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. The priests say that the gods sometimes speak to us through our sleep, showing us visions of what might be or what has been. I wondered what he would think if I told him that the gods had apparently shown me an entire lifetime of what would be, complete with every humiliation and every quiet moment of despair. But instead, I simply nodded and said, perhaps that's what it was. He placed a hand on my shoulder, the gesture both comforting and grounding. Well, whatever visions the gods sent you, you're here now and you're safe, he said firmly. Come down and eat something. Your mother made bread with honey, the way you like it. The mention of my mother's honey bread sent an unexpected wave of emotion through me. In my previous life, I'd taken such small kindnesses for granted, never fully appreciating them until they were replaced by the cold efficiency of the House of Akam's servants. The realization that I could have these moments again, that I could savor them properly this time, felt almost overwhelming. I followed my father down the narrow stairs to our modest dining area. The room was small compared to the grand halls I would later inhabit, but it was warm and filled with morning light streaming through the eastern windows. My mother had set out fresh bread, honey, dates, and a pitcher of watered beer. She looked up when we entered, and I saw the worry still lingering in her eyes, despite her attempt to smile normally. "There you are," she said, gesturing to my usual seat. "Sit down and eat before everything gets cold." I took my place at the table and accepted the plate she offered me. The bread was still warm from the morning baking, and when I tore off a piece and drizzled honey over it, the familiar taste brought back a flood of memories that belonged to both my past and my future simultaneously. I had to focus on chewing slowly to keep my emotions from showing on my face. My parents exchanged a glance across the table, the kind of wordless communication that came from years of partnership. My father cleared his throat and said, "Aseret, there's something your mother and I have been meaning to discuss with you, though we hadn't planned to bring it up quite so soon." I felt my stomach clench with immediate dread. The bread suddenly tasted like ash in my mouth, and I had to force myself to swallow it down. I knew it was coming, even before he continued speaking, because I'd lived through this conversation before. The timing was different from my memories, but the inevitability of it felt like a weight settling onto my shoulders. My mother reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "We've received an inquiry from a family in the capital," she said gently. "The House of Akam. They're looking to arrange a marriage alliance, and they've expressed interest in you." The name hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting it. I must have made some sound or shown something on my face, because my mother's grip on my hand tightened immediately. "I know it seems sudden," she continued quickly, misinterpreting my reaction as shock, rather than the complex mixture of dread and recognition that it actually was. "But this is an extraordinary opportunity for our family, Aseret. The House of Akam is connected to a marquis. Their influence extends throughout the capital and beyond." My father leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. "Their second son, Jalen, is 18 years old, and by all accounts a well-educated and respectable young man," he explained. "The alliance would bring significant benefits to our holding. Trade protections, political connections, and social elevation that could secure our family's position for generations." I stared down at my plate, watching a drop of honey slowly drip from the bread onto the ceramic surface. My mind was racing through calculations and possibilities. In my previous life, this conversation had happened when I was 24, giving me no time to prepare or consider alternatives before being swept up in the arrangements. But now I was 18, which meant I had 4 years before the engagement would typically be finalized. 4 years to find a way out of the fate I'd already lived once. "I know you're young," my mother said, and her voice had taken on a pleading quality that I remembered all too well. "We're not asking you to marry tomorrow. This would simply be an informal understanding between our families, with the formal engagement coming later when you're older. But we need to know if you're willing to consider this path." I looked up at both of my parents and saw the hope written clearly across their faces. They weren't trying to hurt me or trap me into something terrible. They genuinely believed they were offering me a better life, the kind of life they'd never been able to provide through their own limited means. How could I explain to them that the opportunity they saw as salvation was actually a slow poison that would drain away everything I was, until nothing remained but an empty shell, going through the motions? "Can I think about it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady and reasonable. "This is a big decision, and I want to make sure I understand everything it would mean for our family and for me." My parents exchanged another glance, and I could see the slight disappointment in their expressions, even as they tried to hide it. They'd clearly expected me to be excited, or at least be immediately agreeable. My father recovered first, nodding slowly. "The House of Akam could have approached any number of minor nobles, but they chose us, and that means something." I nodded mutely and returned my attention to my breakfast, though I had no appetite left. My mother began talking about the practical aspects of the potential arrangement, the visits we would need to make to the capital, the gifts we should prepare, the proper etiquette for interacting with higher-ranking families. Her words washed over me like water, familiar and suffocating in equal measure. After breakfast, I excused myself and retreated to my room. I needed space to think, to plan, to figure out how I could possibly navigate out of this situation without destroying my family's image and position in the process. "They're saying the Emperor is going to hold a selection for a consort." The other worker made a skeptical sound. "The Emperor? Kamir himself? I thought he'd never marry after marrying Empress Nephira." "Well, this would not be another marriage. Not exactly. A consort position. A concubine. Someone to support the Empress in palace duties. They're opening it to candidates from all backgrounds, not just the high nobles. Can you imagine? Even someone like us could technically apply, though I doubt anyone from our class would have a chance." I froze behind the grain silo, my heart suddenly pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. A consort selection. An imperial position that was open to candidates from various backgrounds. a legitimate, legal way to enter into a binding arrangement that would supersede any previous family negotiations. The worker continued. They say it's unprecedented. The Empress herself is behind it, wanting to bring fresh perspectives into the palace. The selection process will be rigorous though, testing everything from etiquette to practical management to intellectual capacity. Only the most qualified candidates will even make it past the initial rounds. And they'd be bound by imperial law once accepted, the other worker added. No family could interfere with that, not even the highest nobles. It's a direct appointment from the throne. I pressed my back against the rough wood of the silo, my mind racing. This was it. This was the escape route I'd been desperately searching for. If I could enter the selection, if I could make it through even the preliminary rounds, the very act of participating would make any prior family arrangements void. Imperial law superseded all other obligations, and once I was an official candidate, my family wouldn't be forced into the engagement with the House of Akam, and would avoid causing a political incident. But there were significant risks. If I entered the selection and failed to be chosen, I would be marked as someone who'd reached above my station. The House of Akam would likely withdraw their offer entirely, seeing me as either too ambitious or too damaged by the public rejection. My family would lose the alliance they'd worked so hard to secure, and I would bear the blame for that loss. On the other hand, if I didn't try, I would end up exactly where I'd been before. Married to Jaywin, slowly dissolving into nothing in the House of Akam's beautiful rooms, dying alone while my husband attended to other priorities. The choice, when I framed it that way, wasn't really a choice at all. I waited until dinner that evening to bring up the subject, choosing my moment carefully, when both my parents were present and in good spirits after a successful negotiation with a grain merchant. We were finishing our meal when I cleared my throat and said, I'd heard some of the workers talking about an imperial announcement today. Something about a consort selection? My father nodded, swallowing a bite of bread before responding. Yes, the news arrived from the capital yesterday. Emperor Kamir is opening a selection process for a consort position. It's an unusual move, very unconventional. My mother frowned slightly, her protective instincts clearly activated. Why do you ask? She questioned, her eyes narrowing as she studied my face. Surely you're not thinking of entering. Aseret, that would be incredibly dangerous. The competition would be fierce, and someone of your age and limited experience would be at a severe disadvantage. I took a deep breath and met her concerned gaze directly. I know it sounds improbable, I admitted, trying to keep my voice calm and rational. But consider this from a practical standpoint. If I enter the selection and am chosen, even as an alternate or a preliminary candidate, it would bring more honor to our family than any marriage alliance could. If I'm not chosen, then I would return home and we could proceed with the House of Akam arrangement as planned. Absolutely not, my father said immediately, his voice firm with paternal authority. The risk to our family's reputation, and more importantly to your safety, is too great. If you enter and fail, the House of Akam will see it as an insult, as though we were shopping for better offers before committing to them. We'd lose their support entirely, and I don't even want to think about what you will have to go through once those high-ranking families set their eyes on you. But if I'm accepted, even as a candidate, imperial law would require them to release me from any informal agreements, I countered, speaking quickly before I lost my nerve. And the prestige of having a family member in the imperial selection would far outweigh any minor alliance with a marquis's household. My parents exchanged one of their long, silent looks. I could see my mother's jaw tightening, a sure sign that she was working through the calculations in her head. She'd always been the sharper one when it came to navigating social dynamics, and I knew she would see both the potential benefits and the enormous risks. The entry process alone would require a sponsor, she finally said, her tone suggesting she was testing my resolve rather than actually considering the idea. Someone of significant standing would need to vouch for you. We don't have those kinds of connections in the capital. I could try to find one, I said, though I had no idea how I would actually accomplish that. Or perhaps the selection allows for self-sponsorship in certain cases. I would need to research the requirements. My father shook his head slowly, his expression troubled. Aseret, I understand that you're young, and that the idea of the imperial palace must seem exciting, he said, and his voice was gentler now, almost pitying. But this isn't a fairy tale. The palace is full of people who have spent their entire lives preparing for positions of power. You would be competing against candidates who have had the best education, the finest training, and the backing of the most influential families in the empire. What makes you think you could possibly succeed? The honest answer was that I didn't think I would succeed. Not in terms of actually being chosen as the consort, but success wasn't the point. Visibility was the point. Being seen publicly reaching for something beyond what my family's status dictated was the point. Creating a situation where the House of Akam would have to either wait indefinitely or withdraw their offer entirely was the point. But I couldn't explain any of that without revealing the truth about my previous life and my desperate need to avoid repeating it. So instead I simply said, I don't know if I will succeed, but I know that I want to try. Please, just let me try. The pleading note in my voice was real, and I saw my mother's expression soften slightly in response to it. She looked at my father, then back at me, and I could see her wavering between maternal protection and the calculating political mind that had helped keep our small holding afloat for years. We'll discuss it, she finally said, which wasn't a yes, but also wasn't an outright refusal. Your father and I need to talk about this privately and consider all the implications. But Aseret, you need to understand that this isn't just about what you want. Every decision we make affects the entire family's future. I nodded, accepting the conditional response as the small victory it was. I understand, I assured her. I'm not trying to be selfish. I just think this could be an opportunity we shouldn't dismiss without proper consideration. The rest of the dinner passed in uncomfortable silence. I helped clear the dishes and excused myself to my room as soon as I could do so politely. Once alone, I sat on my bed and tried to calm my racing thoughts. I'd planted the seed, but I had no idea if it would take root or if my parents would ultimately forbid me from pursuing this path. All I knew was that I'd taken the first step toward choosing my own fate, instead of passively accepting the one that had been laid out before me. Whether that choice would lead to freedom or disaster remained to be seen. But at least this time, the choice was mine to make. I lay back on my bed and stared at the ceiling, tracing the familiar patterns in the wooden beams above me. In my previous life, I'd never even heard about the consort selection until it was far too late to matter. Now I had a chance to change everything, assuming my parents would let me take it. The uncertainty was terrifying, but it was also the first thing that had felt real and alive since I'd opened my eyes in this younger body. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't just existing. I was fighting for something, and I would not stop fighting until I was either free or gone. Chapter 3. The Merchant's Gambit. The weeks following my conversation with my parents felt like walking through quicksand, each day stretching endlessly as I waited for their decision. They didn't bring up the consort selection again, and I didn't press them, understanding instinctively that pushing too hard would only make them dig in their heels. Instead, I focused on appearing responsible and mature, helping with the estate management and studying the scrolls my father kept in his small library. If I was going to convince them I could handle the capital's complexities, I needed to demonstrate competence in everything I did. On the morning of the 20th day, my mother finally called me into the small study where she and my father handled the household accounts. Baron Coffrin sat behind the modest desk, while Baroness Senet stood by the window, her arms crossed, in a posture I recognized as her preparing to deliver difficult news. "We've made a decision about your request," my mother said without preamble, her tone carefully neutral. "Your father and I have discussed this matter extensively, and we've agreed to allow you to pursue the consort selection under specific conditions." Relief flooded through me so suddenly that I had to grip the back of a nearby chair to steady myself. I managed to keep my voice level as I responded. "Thank you. What are the conditions?" My father leaned forward, his weathered hands folding together on the desk surface. "First, you must secure a legitimate sponsor within the capital," he stated firmly. "We don't have the connections or resources to provide that backing ourselves, so this will be entirely your responsibility. Second, if you cannot find a sponsor within 2 months, you will abandon this pursuit and commit fully to the arrangement with the House of Akom. And third, regardless of the outcome, you will conduct yourself with dignity and bring no dishonor to our family name." "I understand, and I agree to all those terms," I said immediately, not allowing myself time to consider the immense challenge they'd just laid before me. 2 months to find a capital sponsor when I had no connections, no reputation, and no obvious value to offer anyone of significant standing. The task was nearly impossible, but it was still a chance. My mother's expression softened slightly, though concern still lingered in her eyes. "Aseret, I want you to truly understand what you're walking into," she said, moving away from the window to stand beside my father. "The capital isn't like our holding. People there don't value sincerity or hard work the way we do in the provinces. They value power, influence, and the appearance of both. You'll be navigating a world that has no patience for inexperience and no mercy for mistakes." Even though the version of me they saw had never actually experienced the capital's harsh realities. The version of me they couldn't see, the one who had lived and died in the House of Akom, knew exactly what she meant. "But I still want to try." My father stood and walked around the desk, placing a hand on my shoulder in a gesture that reminded me painfully of all the small kindnesses I'd taken for granted before. "Then we'll give you the resources we can spare," he said. "It won't be much, but it should be enough to sustain you in the capital for 2 months if you're careful. After that, You'll either have succeeded in finding a sponsor, or you'll come home, and we'll proceed with the original plan. 3 days later, I departed for the capital with a small travel pack, a modest purse of coins, and a letter of introduction from my father that identified me as the son of Baron Khafren, seeking opportunities in the Imperial City. The letter was diplomatically vague about my specific intentions, which would allow me to approach potential sponsors without immediately revealing my somewhat presumptuous goal. The journey to the capital took 4 days by caravan, and I spent most of that time mentally rehearsing approaches and arguments I could use to convince someone of importance to sponsor an unknown provincial boy. By the time the great city of Tamet-Heru came into view on the horizon, I discarded at least 30 different strategies as either too desperate, too arrogant, or too transparently manipulative. The city itself was exactly as I remembered it from my previous life, though seeing it through younger eyes made the scale of it feel even more overwhelming. The Anu River cut through the heart of Tamet-Heru like a silver ribbon, spanned by massive stone bridges inlaid with lapis lazuli, a deep blue rock that caught the afternoon sun. The white limestone walls of the Imperial Palace rose above the surrounding buildings on elevated ground, their electrum-edged roofs blazing with reflected light. Everywhere I looked, there were people, markets, temples, and a constant hum of commerce and conversation that never seemed to pause even for a moment. I found lodging in a modest inn near the market quarter, a narrow building squeezed between a spice merchant's shop and a textile warehouse. The room I could afford was barely large enough for a sleeping mat and a small chest, but it was clean, and the innkeeper seemed honest enough. I paid for a week in advance and began my search the following morning. My initial strategy was to approach the lesser noble houses, the ones who might see sponsoring a selection candidate as a way to gain favorable attention from the palace without significant investment. I spent 5 days making carefully worded inquiries, presenting my father's letter, and explaining my situation to various stewards and household managers. The responses ranged from polite dismissal to outright mockery. The son of a rural baron, one steward had said, not even bothering to hide his amusement. What could you possibly offer the imperial court? Do you have skills in administration, combat, tactician, or are you simply hoping your provincial charm will be enough? I'd maintained my composure and thanked him for his time, but the rejection stung, precisely because he was right. I had nothing to offer except determination and a desperate need to avoid a fate only I knew was coming. Neither of those qualities translated into political value. By the end of the second week, I'd exhausted my list of noble houses and was running dangerously low on funds. The modest purse my father had given me was meant to last 2 months, but I'd underestimated the cost of everything in the capital. Food was more expensive, the inn charged more than I'd anticipated, and the small bribes I'd needed to pay just to get appointments with various household stewards had drained my resources faster than I'd planned. I was sitting in a small tea house near the temple district, nursing a cup of weak beer I couldn't really afford, and trying to figure out my next move, when I overheard a conversation at the next table that made me pause. Nasira's trading company is expanding again, a man in a merchant's robes was saying to his companion. I heard she just secured a new contract with the palace for textile supplies. That woman has connections everywhere. His companion, an older woman with the calculating eyes of someone who'd spent years in commerce, nodded appreciatively. Nasira didn't build that network by accident, she replied. She's got a sharp mind for politics and an even sharper eye for opportunity. If you want to move goods through the capital efficiently, her company is the one to use. The name meant nothing to me from my previous life, but the description of someone with palace connections and an eye for opportunity seemed promising. I waited until the 2 merchants had left, then approached the tea house owner and asked where I might find Nasira's trading company. The owner gave me directions to a building in the merchant district, not far from the river docks. You'll know it by the blue awning with the lotus symbol, he said, eyeing my worn travel clothes with thinly veiled skepticism. But I'll warn you now, Nasira doesn't meet with just anyone. You'll need an appointment, and her steward is very particular about who gets through the door. I thanked him and made my way to the address he'd provided, knowing I was running out of both time and options. If this didn't work, I'd need to either find some way to earn money in the capital, or admit defeat and return home to face the arrangement with the House of Akum. The trading company was housed in a well-maintained 2-story building, with the promised blue awning stretched across its entrance. The lotus symbol was embroidered in gold thread, and the whole establishment radiated an air of success and efficiency that made my modest provincial clothing feel even more inadequate than usual. I pushed through the entrance and found myself in a reception area, where a young man sat behind a low desk, reviewing what appeared to be shipping manifests. He looked up when I entered, his professional smile not quite reaching his eyes as he assessed me. "Can I help you?" he asked, the polite question carrying an undertone of doubt about whether I belonged there at all. I straightened my shoulders and tried to project more confidence than I felt. "I'm hoping to request a meeting with Aseret," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I have a proposition that might interest her." The young man's expression shifted to barely concealed amusement. "I'm sure you do," he replied, his tone suggesting he'd heard similar claims from countless hopeful petitioners. "However, Aseret's schedule is quite full, and she only takes meetings that have been arranged in advance through proper channels. If you'd like to submit a written request detailing your business, I can see that it reaches her desk, though I can't promise when or if she'll respond." I'd anticipated this obstacle and had prepared a response during my walk from the tea house. "I understand her time is valuable," I said, reaching into my travel pack to retrieve my father's letter. "I'm Aseret, son of Baron Khafren. I'm seeking a sponsor for the Imperial Consort selection, and I believe Nasira's political insight and palace connections make her uniquely positioned to evaluate whether I'm worth that investment." The young man took the letter, though his skeptical expression didn't change as he unfolded it and scanned the contents. When he finished reading, he looked up at me with something that might have been pity, with a hint of irritation. "The consort selection?" he repeated slowly, as if making sure he'd heard correctly. "You're a provincial baron's son with no apparent political experience, no documented skills, and no existing connections. And you want Aseret to sponsor you for one of the most competitive positions in the Empire?" Hearing my situation summarized so bluntly made the absurdity of it impossible to ignore, but I refused to let embarrassment show on my face. "Yes," I said simply. "I understand it's an unusual request, which is precisely why I think it might interest her. If she only takes safe, predictable investments, she wouldn't have built the kind of reputation that brings palace contracts." The young man studied me for a long moment, and I couldn't quite read what he was thinking. Finally, he set down my father's letter and said, "Wait here." He disappeared through a doorway behind his desk, leaving me standing in the reception area, with my heart pounding and my palms sweating, despite the cool interior. I had no idea if my argument had been compelling, or if he'd simply gone to fetch someone to escort me out, but at least he hadn't dismissed me outright. Several minutes passed before the young man returned, his expression now carefully neutral, in a way that suggested he'd been instructed not to reveal his thoughts. "Aseret will see you," he said, and his tone carried a note of surprise that suggested this outcome had been unexpected even to him. "Follow me." He led me through a corridor, lined with shelves holding various samples of fabrics, spices, and other trade goods, then up a narrow staircase to the second floor. We stopped outside a door made of dark wood with brass fittings, and the young man knocked twice before opening it. "The provincial boy who wants to be a consort," he announced, and I couldn't tell if the description was meant to be humorous or mocking. "Thank you, Keprame," a woman's voice said from inside the room. "You can return to your duties." Keprame stepped aside and gestured for me to enter, then closed the door behind me as he left. I found myself in a well-appointed office, with large windows overlooking the river docks. The walls were lined with ledgers and maps, and a large desk dominated the center of the room. Behind that desk sat a woman who appeared to be in her middle years, with sharp, intelligent eyes and the kind of presence that suggested she'd earned her position through competence rather than inheritance. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "Tell me why a baron's son from the provinces thinks he deserves an imperial sponsorship." I took the offered seat and forced myself to meet her direct gaze without flinching. "I don't think I deserve it," I said honestly, deciding that anything less than complete candor would be transparent to someone with her obvious experience. "I have no special skills, no meaningful connections, and no political experience that would make me an obvious candidate. What I do have is determination, and a very specific reason for wanting to enter this selection that has nothing to do with ambition or power." Aseret leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her, as she regarded me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "Most people who seek imperial positions are driven by ambition or power," she observed. "What drives you instead?" I hesitated, knowing that the truth would sound either crazy or calculated, depending on how she chose to interpret it. But I'd committed to honesty, so I pressed forward. "I want autonomy," I said carefully. "I want to be visible enough that my choices matter, and that I can't be quietly erased or dismissed. The consort selection offers that visibility in a way that nothing else available to someone of my status possibly could." "Erased by whom?" Aseret asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you running from?" The question was too perceptive, cutting straight to the heart of my situation in a way that made me suspect she already knew more than she was letting on. I took a breath and made a calculated decision to share more than I'd planned. "My family has arranged an engagement for me. To the House of Akam." It's a good match politically, one that would bring significant benefits to my family. But I don't want it. I don't want to spend my life as someone's accessory, important only for the alliance I represent, and dismissed in every other way that matters. Nasira was quiet for a long moment, her sharp eyes studying my face, as if searching for deception or hidden motives. Finally, she asked, "And if you're not selected as consort? If you go through this entire process and still end up returning home?" "Then at least I tried," I said. "At least the choice was mine, even if the outcome wasn't what I hoped for." She made a small approval sound. "You understand that being a consort isn't freedom, right?" she said, her tone careful and measured. "It's a different kind of cage, one with its own rules and constraints. You'd be trading one set of expectations for another." "I understand that," I replied, "but it would be a cage I chose, with bars I can see clearly. That matters to me more than you might think." Nasira stood and walked to the window, looking out over the river and the bustling docks below. I waited, not daring to speak and break whatever thought process she was working through. When she finally turned back to face me, she wore a serious expression. "I'm going to sponsor you," she said, and her tone was matter-of-fact rather than generous. "Not because I think you'll win the selection, but because I'm curious to see what you'll do with the opportunity. I want someone in that palace who isn't from the traditional noble families, someone who understands what it means to have limited options, and who might actually use whatever influence they gain to make changes, rather than just preserving the status quo." Relief and disbelief crashed through me in equal measure, and I had to remind myself to breathe normally before responding. "Thank you," I managed to say, though the words felt entirely inadequate for what she was offering me. "I promise I won't make you regret this decision." She waved away my gratitude with a dismissive gesture. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she said, returning to her desk and pulling out a fresh sheet of papyrus. "What I need from you is honesty and effort. The palace will provide everything else you need in terms of training and preparation once you're accepted as a candidate. My sponsorship will get you through the door, but what happens after that is entirely up to you." Over the next hour, Nasira explained the practicalities of the sponsorship process. She would submit the formal documentation to the palace on my behalf, which would include her personal guarantee of my character and potential. In return, I would be expected to report to her regularly about the selection process, providing information about the other candidates, the tests we were given, and the political dynamics within the palace. "Information is currency in the capital," she explained as she drafted the sponsorship letter. "I'm investing in you, and I expect a return on that investment, even if you're not ultimately selected. The insights you provide will be valuable for understanding how the palace operates and who holds influence within it." I agreed to her terms without hesitation, understanding that I was getting far more out of this arrangement than she was. The fact that she was willing to take such a risk on an unknown provincial boy suggested either remarkable generosity or some hidden agenda I hadn't yet identified. But either way, I wasn't in a position to question my good fortune. 3 days later, I received notification that my candidacy had been formally accepted by the palace. The message was delivered by an imperial courier, who handed me a sealed letter bearing the emperor's mark, and the weight of that seal in my hands felt like both a victory and a beginning of something I couldn't yet fully comprehend. The letter instructed me to present myself at the palace gates in 1 week's time, bringing only essential personal items, as all other necessities would be provided. Once I entered the palace grounds, I would be cut off from all external contact for the duration of the selection process, with no exceptions permitted, regardless of family circumstances or personal emergencies. I read the letter 3 times, making sure I understood every word and every implication. This was real. I was actually going to do this. The path I'd chosen would either lead to freedom or complete disaster, but at least it was mine. I sent word to my parents, who both were cautiously excited, and wished me luck. On my final evening before entering the palace, I returned to Nasira's trading company to thank her one last time and to receive any final instructions she might have. Keprayam led me to her office as before, though this time his expression was less skeptical and more curious, as if he was trying to figure out what his employer had seen in me. Nasira greeted me with a slight nod and gestured for me to sit. "Tomorrow you cross a threshold you can't return from," she said without preamble. "Once you enter those palace gates, every decision you make will have consequences that extend beyond just you. Are you prepared for that?" "As prepared as I can be," I answered honestly. "I know I'm walking into something much larger than myself, but I'd rather face that challenge than accept the alternative." She studied me for a moment, then reached into her desk and withdrew a small object, wrapped in linen cloth. "Take this," she said, handing it across the desk to me. "Consider it a reminder of why you're doing this." I unwrapped the cloth and found a small scarab amulet made of deep blue stone, carved with intricate detail and polished to a soft sheen. The scarab was a symbol of rebirth and transformation, and the significance of the gift was not lost on me, given my unusual circumstances. Closing my fingers around the amulet and feeling its cool weight in my palm. I'll keep it with me. Nasira stood, signaling that our meeting was concluded. Remember what I told you about information, she said, as I rose from my chair. Pay attention to everything. Trust no one completely, and don't let anyone convince you that you're less capable than you are, simply because of where you come from. I nodded and turned to leave, but her voice stopped me before I reached the door. Aseret, she said, and when I looked back, her expression had softened almost imperceptibly. You're braver than you give yourself credit for. Don't forget that when things get difficult. I left the trading company with those words echoing in my mind. The scarab amulet tucked safely in my travel pack, alongside the few possessions I was bringing to the palace. As I walked back to the inn through the evening streets of Tamet-Heru, I allowed myself one moment of uncertainty and fear before pushing those feelings aside. Tomorrow I would enter the Imperial Palace and begin a selection process that would test me in ways I couldn't yet imagine. But for tonight, I was simply a provincial boy who'd managed to secure an impossible opportunity through a combination of desperation and an unexpected ally. Whatever came next, at least I would face it standing up, rather than slowly fading away in silence. Chapter 4. The Palace. The palace gates were even more imposing up close than they had appeared from a distance. I stood before them in the early morning light, my small travel pack clutched in one hand, and Nasira's scarab amulet tucked safely in my pocket. 22 other candidates had gathered in the courtyard outside the gates, and I found myself automatically cataloging them the way I learned to assess social hierarchies during my previous life in the House of Akom. Most were clearly from higher noble families, based on their clothing and bearing. Their linen robes were finer than mine, dyed in colors that spoke of expense and status, and they carried themselves with the casual confidence that came from growing up surrounded by power. A few stood in small clusters, already forming alliances based on family connections they brought with them from outside. Others stood alone, like me, though their isolation seemed more strategic than uncertain. One young woman near the front of the group caught my attention immediately. She wore deep purple linen, edged with gold thread, and her posture radiated the kind of authority that suggested she was used to being obeyed without question. Her dark hair was elaborately styled with golden pins, and she surveyed the other candidates with an expression that managed to be both assessing and dismissive at the same time. When her gaze swept over me, I saw her eyes narrow slightly before moving on, clearly categorizing me as beneath her concern. A palace official emerged from the gates, an older man with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades navigating court politics. He clapped his hands once to get our attention, and the courtyard fell silent immediately. I am Steward Rahemet, he announced, his voice carrying easily across the assembled group. You have all been accepted as candidates for the Imperial Consort selection. From this moment forward, you are guests of the palace and subject to its rules. You will have no contact with your families or sponsors for the duration of the selection. You will compete fairly and honorably, and any candidate found to be engaging in sabotage or dishonest practices will be immediately removed, and their families will suffer the consequences accordingly. He paused, letting that warning settle over us before continuing. The selection will test your skills in etiquette, household management, intellectual capacity, and your ability to represent the Empire with dignity. Some of you will excel. Most of you will not. Those who fail to meet our standards will be sent home at the conclusion of each testing phase. Is this understood? A chorus of affirmative responses rose from the assembled candidates, mine included. Steward Rahemet nodded once, then gestured toward the open gates. Your chambers have been prepared, and you will have the remainder of today to settle in before formal testing begins tomorrow morning. We filed through the gates in a loose procession, and I felt the weight of crossing that threshold settle onto my shoulders like a physical thing. There was no going back now, no changing my mind or reconsidering my choices. I was committed to this path regardless of where it led. The palace interior was exactly as I remembered it from my previous life's few visits to the capital for official functions. White limestone walls soared overhead, carved with hieroglyphs and painted with scenes of the gods. Lotus columns supported the high ceilings, and the air was cool despite the heat outside, thanks to the clever design of the ventilation shafts. Everywhere I looked, there was beauty and order, the kind of carefully maintained perfection that required an army of servants to sustain. Steward Rahemet led us through a series of corridors to the candidate's wing, a section of the palace that had apparently been prepared specifically for this selection. The chambers were arranged along a central courtyard, with a reflecting pool at its center, and each room was marked with a name placard indicating which candidate had been assigned to it. I found my chamber near the end of the corridor, a modest but comfortable space with a sleeping platform a writing desk, a clothes chest, and a small window overlooking one of the palace gardens. It was significantly better than the room I'd occupied at the House of Akom, though I tried not to let that comparison occupy too much of my thoughts. The point wasn't to find a better cage, but to find freedom, and I needed to keep that distinction clear in my mind. After unpacking my few belongings and placing the scarab amulet on the writing desk where I could see it, I ventured back out to the central courtyard to observe the other candidates. Some were already forming social groups, introducing themselves, and establishing the hierarchies that would likely persist throughout the selection. Others remained solitary, either by choice or because they'd been excluded from the emerging power structures. The young woman in purple linen was holding court near the reflecting pool, surrounded by a half-dozen other candidates who seemed eager for her attention and approval. I caught fragments of her conversation as I passed by, enough to learn that her name was Aseret, and that she was the daughter of a duke with direct connections to several high-ranking palace officials. Of course, my family has been advising the imperial household for 3 generations, Aseret was saying, her tone managing to sound both modest and boastful simultaneously. I grew up understanding how the court functions, so I suspect much of this selection will feel quite familiar to me. One of the candidates in her circle, a young man with expensive jewelry and an eager expression, laughed appreciatively. The rest of us will have to work twice as hard just to keep up with you, he said, and the sycophantic quality of his voice made my stomach turn slightly. I continued past them without attempting to insert myself into their conversation, knowing instinctively that any effort to join that particular group would be rejected, or worse, accepted in a way that made my lower status painfully obvious. Instead, I found a quiet corner of the courtyard where I could observe without being noticed, at least for the moment. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous energy and careful social navigation. Dinner was served in a communal hall, and I found myself seated between 2 other candidates who seemed as uncertain about the protocol as I was. We made awkward small talk about our respective families and home territories, sharing just enough information to be polite, without revealing anything that could be used against us later. That night, I lay on my sleeping platform and stared at the ceiling, my mind racing through possibilities and strategies. Tomorrow the actual testing would begin, and I had no idea what to expect or how I would measure up against candidates who had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this kind of opportunity. Sleep came eventually, though it was restless and filled with fragmented dreams that mixed memories of my previous life with anxieties about the present. The morning bell woke us before dawn, and we were instructed to dress in the formal robes that had been provided in our chambers. The garments were identical in cut, but varied in color, apparently assigned based on some criteria I didn't understand. Mine was a deep rust color that reminded me of the earth in my family's fields, while Saret's was the same purple she'd been wearing yesterday, suggesting the colors might be tied to family rank. Steward Rahemet gathered us in the communal hall and explained the first test with the kind of clinical precision that suggested he'd overseen many such evaluations before. We would be participating in a formal dinner attended by palace officials who would observe our comportment, conversation skills, and ability to navigate complex social situations. Each candidate would be scored on multiple criteria, and those who failed to meet minimum standards would be dismissed at the conclusion of the test. The dinner was held in one of the palace's smaller banquet halls, though smaller was a relative term, given that it could easily accommodate 50 people with room to spare. We were seated at a long table, with palace officials interspersed between candidates, forcing us to engage in conversation, rather than clustering with our fellow competitors. I found myself seated between an older woman who introduced herself as a treasury administrator, and a younger man who served as an assistant to one of the palace's diplomatic advisors. Both were polite, but clearly evaluating everything I said and did, their eyes tracking my movements with the kind of attention that made every gesture feel magnified and significant. The meal itself was elaborate, course after course of delicacies I'd never encountered in my rural holding. I watched the other candidates carefully and mimicked their techniques for eating unfamiliar foods, knowing that any obvious mistakes would be noted and counted against me. Conversation flowed around the table, touching on topics ranging from agricultural policy to artistic trends in the capital to philosophical questions about justice and governance. I contributed where I could, drawing on my limited knowledge and trying to sound thoughtful rather than ignorant when faced with subjects beyond my experience. About halfway through the meal, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision and turned my head slightly to see what was happening. Saret, seated several places down from me, had somehow managed to position herself so that her wine cup was directly in line with my elbow. I realized with sudden clarity what was about to happen, but before I could adjust my position, the candidate seated across from me asked me a direct question that required an immediate response. I answered while simultaneously shifting my arm away from the table's edge, creating just enough space that when Aseret accidentally knocked her cup over a moment later, the wine spilled onto the table rather than onto my formal robes. The liquid spread across the white linen tablecloth in a dark stain, and several officials looked up from their conversations to see what had caused the disturbance. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Aseret said, her voice pitched to carry just the right note of embarrassed apology. "I'm so sorry, I must have misjudged the distance." A servant appeared immediately to clean up the spill, and the meal continued without further incident. But I caught Saret's eyes across the table, and saw the flash of frustration there, before she smoothed her expression back into pleasant neutrality. She'd tried to embarrass me publicly, to make me look incompetent or careless in front of the evaluating officials, and I'd managed to avoid her trap through a combination of observation and luck. The dinner concluded without any other obvious attempts at sabotage, though I remained hyper-aware of everything happening around me for the rest of the evening. When we were finally dismissed back to our chambers, I felt exhausted from the constant vigilance required to navigate both the formal evaluation and the social maneuvering of my fellow candidates. I was halfway to my chamber when I noticed that one of the garden paths leading away from the main corridor was lit by small oil lamps, suggesting it was open for use despite the late hour. On impulse, I decided to walk for a few minutes before retiring, hoping the fresh air might settle my racing thoughts enough to allow for actual sleep. The garden was beautiful in the lamplight, with carefully maintained beds of flowers and herbs, creating patterns of color and fragrance. A few other people were scattered throughout the space, mostly servants going about their evening duties, though I also spotted what appeared to be a palace guard standing near one of the ornamental fountains. Except as I got closer, I realized the man's posture was wrong for a guard. He stood too casually, with none of the rigid formality that characterized the palace's security personnel. He wore simple linen robes that could have belonged to any mid-level official, and his face was partially shadowed by the branches of a date palm overhanging the fountain. I should have walked past him and returned to my chamber, but something about his presence drew my attention in a way I couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was the way he seemed completely comfortable in the palace gardens despite the late hour. Or perhaps it was simply that he represented something outside the competitive pressure of the candidate's wing. He noticed me approaching and turned slightly, his face coming into better light. He appeared to be perhaps 10 years older than me, with the kind of strong features that would have been memorable in any context. His eyes were intelligent and assessing, but not in the cold, calculating way of the palace officials who'd evaluated us during dinner. "You're one of the consort candidates," he said, and it was a statement rather than a question. "You look like you had a difficult evening." I managed a tired smile, appreciating that he hadn't asked if I was nervous, or offered empty reassurances about how well I must be doing. "The first formal test was today," I explained, moving closer to the fountain. "I'm still trying to figure out if I passed or failed spectacularly." "If you're still here, you probably didn't fail," he observed, his tone matter-of-fact. "They remove candidates quickly when the deficiencies are obvious. Uncertainty usually means you performed adequately, if not brilliantly." "That's a comforting thought," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure if it actually was comforting, or just a different kind of pressure. "Are you a palace official? You seem very familiar with how the selection process works." He smiled slightly, an expression that suggested I'd asked an amusing question, without quite understanding why it was funny. "I work in the palace, yes," he said, which was technically an answer without actually providing any useful information. "And I've seen enough of these evaluations to know how they typically unfold." We stood in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the gentle sound of water flowing from the fountain. I found myself relaxing slightly in his presence, the constant vigilance that had characterized my entire day finally easing just enough to let me breathe properly. "Why did you enter the selection?" His eyes studying my face with genuine curiosity rather than calculated assessment. "Most candidates come from families that have been preparing them for this kind of opportunity since childhood. You don't strike me as someone who fits that pattern." I considered deflecting the question, or offering a politically safe answer about honor and service, but something about his directness invited honesty in return. "I wanted to be visible," I said carefully, choosing my words with the same caution I'd used during the dinner test, just in case. To make a choice that mattered, and that couldn't be quietly undone or dismissed. The selection offered that visibility in a way that nothing else available to me possibly could. He tilted his head slightly, considering my response. "That's an unusual motivation," he observed. "Most people want power or influence. You want to be seen." "Being seen is a kind of power," I replied, surprised by how easily the words came. "When you're invisible, other people get to decide what happens to you. When you're visible, at least you have some say in your own fate, even if that fate isn't what you originally hoped for." "And what did you originally hope for?" he asked, his voice quieter now and somehow more intimate despite the open garden setting. I looked away from him, focusing on the fountain's reflection in the lamplight. I don't know anymore, I admitted. I used to think I wanted safety and partnership and a life where I mattered to someone. But I've learned the hard way that the illusion of obtaining those things can be devastating, and sometimes the safest choice is to be content with surviving. The bitterness in my voice surprised even me, and I regretted the words as soon as they left my mouth. I'd revealed too much, shown vulnerability to someone I didn't know and couldn't trust, all because his apparent kindness had made me forget for a moment that everything in the palace was performance and calculation. But instead of using my admission against me, or offering hollow sympathy, he simply nodded, as if I'd said something that made perfect sense. The palace is full of people who deceive to get what they want, he said quietly. They go through the motions of their duties and their relationships, and treat them as transactions, with little sincerity. I looked back at him, startled by how closely his observation aligned with my own experiences in my previous life. You sound like you're speaking from personal experience, I said. He smiled again, though this time the expression carried a hint of sadness. Let's just say I understand the difference between going through the motions and actually living, he replied. And I can tell you're someone who's trying very hard to figure out which one you're doing right now. Though the conversation wandered through topics that had nothing to do with the selection or palace politics. He asked about my family's holding, and I found myself describing the smell of grain dust and the sound of my mother directing the harvest workers with more honesty and detail than I'd shared with anyone since arriving in the capital. He told me about growing up in the palace, though he was careful to keep the details vague enough that I couldn't quite place his exact position or role. Eventually, a distant bell chimed to mark the late hour, and I realized I needed to return to my chamber before my absence was noted and potentially counted against me. I stood reluctantly, oddly disappointed to end the conversation, despite not even knowing his name. Thank you, I said, meaning it more than the simple phrase could possibly convey. For the conversation, I mean. It helped. You'll do better than you think, he replied, standing as well. Just remember that the evaluators are looking for competence and character, not perfection. Show them who you are, rather than trying to perform who you think they want to see. I nodded and turned to go, but his voice stopped me before I'd taken more than a few steps. What's your name? He asked. Aseret, I replied, looking back at him. And yours? He hesitated for just a moment, and I saw something flicker across his face before he answered. You can call me Kai, he said, which I suspected wasn't his full name, but was apparently all he was willing to offer. I smiled and continued back to my chamber, his words echoing in my mind as I prepared for sleep. Show them who you are, rather than trying to perform who you think they want to see. The advice seemed impossible, given that I barely knew who I was anymore, after dying and being reborn into a life that was simultaneously familiar and completely alien. But as I drifted off to sleep, I found myself thinking less about the selection and more about the way Kai had listened to me speak about my family's holding. His attention focused and genuine, in a way that reminded me of what I'd once hoped to find with Jalen, before reality had slowly eroded that hope into nothing. The next several days blurred together in a series of tests and evaluations. We were assessed on our ability to manage household accounts, our knowledge of court protocol, our skill in written communication, and our capacity for strategic thinking. Some candidates excelled in areas where I struggled, while I occasionally surprised myself by performing well in tests I'd expected to fail. Aseret continued to dominate the social hierarchy among the candidates, her confidence and connections making her the clear frontrunner in everyone's estimation, including, I suspected, her own. But I also noticed cracks in her perfect facade, moments when her frustration showed through the polished exterior, particularly when other candidates performed better than expected on tests where she'd assumed her superiority was guaranteed. I encountered Kai several more times in the gardens, always in the evening, after the day's evaluations had concluded. Our conversations became something I looked forward to, a respite from the constant performance and calculation that characterized every other interaction in the palace. He never revealed more about his position or role, and I didn't press him for details, content to simply have someone I could talk to honestly, without worrying about how my words would be used against me. It was during our 5th meeting that the nature of our relationship shifted into something beyond simple conversation. We'd been talking about literature, of all things, and I'd mentioned a particular poet whose work my father had kept in his small library back home. Kai had quoted a passage from memory, the words flowing with the kind of easy familiarity that came from genuine appreciation rather than academic study. You have excellent taste in poetry, I'd said, smiling at him across the fountain where we'd fallen into the habit of meeting. I've always found that poetry says things that regular conversation can't quite manage, he'd replied. And there was something in his tone that suggested he was talking about more than just literary appreciation. The conversation had continued, but underneath the words there'd been a growing awareness of each other's presence, a kind of tension that was neither uncomfortable nor ignorable. When Kai had stepped closer to point out a constellation in the night sky above us, I'd felt the warmth of his body near mine, and realized with sudden clarity that I wanted him to be even closer. He must have sensed the shift in my attention, because he paused mid-sentence and looked down at me, his expression questioning without being pushy. "Aseret," he'd said quietly, and my name and his voice had sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. I'd reached up and touched his face, my fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a boldness that surprised me. "Is this allowed?" I'd asked, knowing the question was ridiculous, but needing to ask it anyway. "Probably not," he'd admitted, his hand coming up to cover mine where it rested against his cheek. "But I've never been very good at following rules that don't make sense." He'd kissed me then, gently giving me room to pull away if I wanted to. But I hadn't wanted to pull away. I'd wanted to sink into the warmth of his body and feel something real. We'd stayed in the garden far too long that night, trading kisses and careful touches that spoke of desire tempered by uncertainty. I'd finally pulled away when the late bell chimed, knowing I needed to return to my chamber before my absence became a problem. But the warmth of Kai's arms had made it very difficult to leave. "This is dangerous," I'd said. I hadn't been able to make the words sound like a genuine objection. "Most things worth having are," he'd replied, brushing a strand of hair back from my face with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "But we can stop if you want to. I won't push you into anything you're not ready for." I'd shaken my head, surprised by my own certainty. "I don't want to stop," I'd admitted. "I'm just afraid of what happens when this inevitably ends badly." "Then let's not worry about inevitable endings," Kai had suggested, pulling me close again for one more kiss before finally releasing me. "Let's just see where this goes and deal with complications as they arise." I'd returned to my chamber that night, with my lips still tingling, and my mind racing with equal parts excitement and terror. I was risking everything I'd worked for by allowing this attraction to develop. But for the first time since entering the palace, I felt truly alive. The physical intimacy deepened over the following nights. Though we were careful to keep our meetings secret, and our touches confined to the shadowed corners of the garden where we were unlikely to be observed. Kai was patient with my inexperience, and generous with his attention, and I found myself learning what it meant to be desired rather than tolerated, wanted rather than merely accepted. But even as I lost myself in the pleasure of his touch and the warmth of his presence, a part of my mind remained vigilant and suspicious. This felt too good, too easy, too perfectly timed to be entirely coincidental. I'd learned in my previous life that nothing in noble circles happened without calculation and purpose. And while Kai seemed genuine in his affection, I couldn't quite silence the voice in my head that whispered about ulterior motives and hidden agendas. After one particularly intense encounter that had left us both breathless and tangled together on a stone bench, hidden behind a screen of flowering vines, I'd voiced some of my concerns while we were still wrapped in each other's arms. "Why me?" I'd asked, my head resting against his shoulder. "You work in the palace, which means you could probably have your pick of partners. So why choose a provincial candidate with no connections and no real prospects of winning this selection?" Kai had been quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing absent patterns on my back. "Because you're real," he'd finally said. "Everyone else in this place is performing all the time, saying what they think others want to hear and presenting carefully curated versions of themselves. But when you talk to me, I can tell you're actually saying what you think and feel, not what you've calculated will produce the best outcome." "That just makes me naive," I'd pointed out, though his answer had touched something in me that I'd thought was too damaged to respond to kindness anymore. "No," he disagreed, tilting my face up so he could look directly at me. "It makes you brave. It takes courage to be honest in a place where honesty is usually punished." I'd wanted to believe him, had wanted to trust that this connection between us was as genuine as it felt, but I couldn't quite let go of my suspicions entirely. To continue allowing the physical intimacy to deepen, because the alternative was to return to the isolation and performance that had characterized my previous life, and I'd already died once from that particular form of slow suffocation. It was after our 7th meeting, when I'd returned to my chambers still flushed and disheveled from Kai's attentions, that I noticed the servant waiting outside my door. She was young, maybe my age, and her eyes flicked briefly to the garden path I'd just come from, before settling on my face with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Good evening," she'd said, her voice carefully neutral. "I came to inform you that you're wanted for testing tomorrow morning. The steward asked me to remind all candidates to rest well tonight." "Thank you," I'd replied, trying to smooth my robes and appear as though I'd simply been taking an evening walk, rather than engaging in activities that were almost certainly against palace rules. She'd nodded and turned to leave, but not before I'd caught another brief glance toward the garden path. The message was clear even if unspoken. I was being watched, My nighttime absences had been noted, and whether that information would be used against me remained to be seen. I'd entered my chamber and closed the door, my earlier contentment replaced by a creeping anxiety about what I'd put at risk by allowing my desire for connection to override my caution. The selection was the only path I had to avoid returning to the fate I'd already lived once, and I was potentially throwing it away for a relationship that could never be more than a secret garden affair with someone whose real name I didn't even know. But as I'd prepared for sleep that night, I'd felt the scarab amulet in my pocket, and remembered what Nasira had told me about being braver than I gave myself credit for. Perhaps bravery meant accepting the risk of being hurt again, in exchange for the possibility of finding something real. Or perhaps it just meant I was making the same mistakes in a different context, trading one form of inevitable disappointment for another. Either way, I'd made my choices, and now I would have to live with whatever consequences arose from them. I fell asleep that night, with Kai's touch still warm on my skin, and the knowledge that someone, somewhere in the palace, was paying very close attention to everything I did. Chapter 5. Unraveling Threads. The morning after the servant's pointed glance brought a new test that felt more like a battlefield than an evaluation. Steward Rahimet gathered us in the palace's administrative wing, a section I hadn't visited before, that was filled with the quiet efficiency of scribes and record keepers going about their daily work. The air smelled of papyrus and ink, and the walls were lined with shelves holding countless scrolls organized with meticulous precision. Today you will once again demonstrate your capacity for practical household management, Rahimet announced, his voice carrying the same clinical detachment it always did during test briefings. Each of you will be assigned a theoretical scenario involving resource allocation, staff coordination, and crisis management. You will have 4 hours to develop a comprehensive plan addressing all aspects of the situation, and your proposals will be evaluated on efficiency, creativity, and realistic implementation. He distributed small sealed papyrus scrolls to each candidate, instructing us not to open them until we were settled in our assigned workspaces. I found myself placed in a small alcove with a writing desk, adequate lighting, and all the materials I would need to complete the task. The other candidates were scattered throughout the wing in similar spaces, close enough that I could occasionally hear the scratch of reed pens on papyrus, but far enough that actual collaboration would be impossible. I broke the seal on my scroll and read the scenario I'd been given. I was to organize a diplomatic reception for visiting dignitaries from a southern territory, managing everything from menu planning to entertainment to security considerations, all while working within a specified budget and accommodating various dietary restrictions and cultural protocols. The scenario was complex, but not impossible, requiring careful attention to detail and an understanding of how different elements of event planning interconnected. I spread out fresh papyrus and began outlining my approach, starting with the most critical elements and working my way through to the finer details. I'd helped my mother plan harvest festivals back home, which gave me some practical experience with coordinating multiple moving parts. Though the scale of this diplomatic reception was significantly larger than anything I'd actually managed before. About 2 hours into the work period, I reached for my pot of ink and noticed immediately that something was wrong. The consistency was too thin, almost watery, and when I tested it on a scrap of papyrus, the characters came out pale and uneven, barely legible. I checked the ink pot more carefully and realized that someone had diluted it, probably adding water to reduce its effectiveness without making it completely unusable. My heart started pounding as I considered the implications. If I submitted work written with this poor quality ink, it would look unprofessional and careless, reflecting badly on my attention to detail, regardless of how sound my actual planning was. But if I reported the sabotage, I would look like I was making excuses or trying to blame my tools for my own inadequacy. I took a slow breath and forced myself to think strategically rather than reactively. The ink had clearly been tampered with, which meant someone had accessed my workspace before I arrived. That kind of access suggested either a candidate willing to break palace rules for an advantage, or possibly a servant who'd been bribed or coerced into assisting with said sabotage. Either way, I needed evidence before making any accusations. I stood and walked to Steward Rahimet's desk at the front of the administrative wing, carrying my inkpot and the test papyrus I'd used to confirm the problem. He looked up from the documents he was reviewing, his expression mildly annoyed at the interruption. "Steward Rahimet," I said quietly, keeping my voice level and professional. "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe there's been an issue with my materials that requires your attention." I showed him the diluted ink and the nearly invisible test characters, explaining that I discovered the problem when I first attempted to use the ink provided in my workspace. I made no accusations about how it had happened, simply presented the facts, and requested either replacement ink or permission to use my own materials if that was acceptable under the testing rules. Rahimet examined the inkpot and the test papyrus with the careful attention of someone who'd probably seen every possible form of cheating and sabotage during his years overseeing palace evaluations. His expression remained neutral, but I saw his eyes narrow slightly as he recognized that this was definitely tampering, rather than natural degradation of the materials. "Wait here," he instructed, standing and walking to the storage area where the testing supplies were kept. He returned a few minutes later with a fresh inkpot and also a second scribe, who I recognized as one of the palace's senior record keepers. "I'm going to have Master Scribe Mareth witness the condition of your original materials and document this incident," Rahimet explained, his tone suggesting this was standard procedure rather than special treatment. "If there has been interference with testing materials, it needs to be properly recorded and investigated." Mareth examined both inkpots carefully, comparing their consistency and making notes on a small tablet. He asked me several questions about when I discovered the problem and whether I'd noticed anyone near my workspace before the test began, explaining that I'd arrived directly from the candidate's wing and hadn't seen anyone suspicious, though I acknowledged that the administrative wing had been busy with palace staff preparing for the day's work. After Mareth finished his documentation, Rahimet dismissed me back to my workspace with the fresh inkpot and a notation that I would be given an additional 30 minutes to complete my proposal to account for the time lost to this incident. I thanked him and returned to my alcove, my mind racing with questions about who would have tampered with my materials and why. The most obvious suspect was Aseret, who'd already demonstrated her willingness to engage in subtle sabotage during the dinner test. But this felt more aggressive than simply trying to make me spill wine on myself, and I wasn't sure she would risk the kind of direct interference that could be discovered and documented, unless she was confident that any investigation would dead end before reaching her, which was entirely possible given her family connections and political influence. I'd pushed those thoughts aside and focused on completing my proposal with the working ink. I had 4.5 hours total now, thanks to the time extension, and I intended to use every minute to create the most comprehensive and well-reasoned plan I was capable of producing. By the time Steward Rahimet called for us to submit our completed work, I'd developed a detailed proposal that addressed every aspect of the scenario while staying within the specified budget. I'd included contingency plans for various potential complications, and had even suggested ways to use the diplomatic reception as an opportunity to showcase local artisans and cultural traditions, hopefully adding value beyond the basic requirements of hosting foreign dignitaries. Whether my work would be judged favorably remained to be seen, but at least I'd done my best with the time and resources available to me. The results of the test were posted 2 days later, and I was relieved to see my name listed among the candidates who'd performed adequately enough to continue in the selection. Saharet's name topped the rankings as expected, but I also noticed that several candidates who'd seemed confident and well-prepared had been removed from the list entirely, their deficiencies apparently too significant to overlook. What I didn't know until later was that Steward Rahimet's investigation into the tampered ink had revealed something far more significant than a single act of sabotage. The trail had led to a network of servants and minor officials who'd been accepting bribes from several high-ranking families to interfere with the selection process in various subtle ways. The discovery had prompted Empress Nephira herself to take direct action, and the results were swift and devastating. I learned about it during dinner, one evening, when the entire candidates' wing was abruptly summoned to the main courtyard by palace guards. We assembled in confused silence, uncertain what was happening or whether this was another test we hadn't been warned about. Steward Rahimet appeared with several other palace officials I didn't recognize, their formal robes and serious expressions suggesting this was something far more significant than a routine announcement. 3 candidates have been removed from the selection effective immediately, Rahimet declared, his voice carrying across the assembled group with unusual gravity. Their families attempted to corrupt the integrity of this process through bribery and coercion of palace staff. This behavior is unacceptable and reflects poorly not just on the candidates themselves, but on the houses they represent. He read 3 names from a scroll, and I felt my stomach drop when I heard the third one. Aseret, daughter of the Duke, who'd seemed so confident in her inevitable success, was being expelled from the selection, along with 2 other candidates from similarly powerful families. Furthermore, Rahimet continued, an investigation conducted by the Empress's office has revealed that the families involved were engaged in corruption extending far beyond this selection. Charges of embezzlement, abuse of office, and manipulation of imperial appointments have been filed. The full weight of imperial law will be brought to bear on those responsible. The courtyard erupted in shocked whispers and exclamations, but Rahimet raised his hand for silence. Let this serve as a core message to everyone present, he said firmly. The Empire's integrity is not negotiable, and those who attempt to subvert it for personal gain will be held accountable regardless of their rank or connections. You are dismissed back to your chambers. We dispersed in stunned groups, everyone trying to process what we just witnessed. The removal of 3 candidates, including the frontrunner, had dramatically shifted the dynamics of the selection. But more than that, the public exposure of corruption and the swift punishment of powerful families sent a clear signal that someone in the palace was willing to use this selection as an opportunity to clean house and challenge the traditional power structures. I returned to my chamber in a daze, my mind working through the implications. The tampering with my ink had apparently been part of a much larger pattern, and the investigation triggered by that incident had uncovered corruption that went far beyond simple sabotage of testing materials. Someone with significant authority had seized on this evidence as justification for dismantling an entire network of corrupt officials and nobles. But who had that kind of power and motivation? And more importantly, why had they chosen to act now, using the consort selection as their catalyst? I thought about Nasira and her interest in having someone in the palace who wasn't from the traditional noble families. I thought about the subtle protections that had seemed to surround me since entering the selection. The way my sabotage materials had been discovered and documented, while other candidates might have simply been judged on their poor work without anyone investigating why. Someone was protecting me, or more accurately, someone was using me as a tool to accomplish objectives I didn't fully understand. The realization should have frightened me, but instead, I felt a strange sense of vindication. I'd entered this selection to be visible, to make choices that mattered, and apparently, my presence was mattering in ways I'd never anticipated. That evening I went to the garden at the usual time, half expecting Kai not to appear given the upheaval of the day's events. But he was there as always, waiting by the fountain, with an expression that suggested he'd heard about the expelled candidates, and wanted to see how I was processing everything. "Quite a day," he said as I approached, his tone carefully neutral, in a way that suggested he was giving me space to react however I needed to. "Are you secretly some high-ranking official who's been using our relationship to gather information about the candidates?" I'd meant it as a joke, a way to deflect my own nervousness. But Kai's expression shifted into something complicated and painful. "I would never use you like that," he said firmly, turning to face me fully. "Whatever else is true about my position, or my reasons for being in this palace, my feelings for you are genuine. I need you to believe that." "I want to believe it," I said honestly. "But Kai, I've learned the hard way that wanting something to be true doesn't make it real. And right now I'm involved in something much larger than I understand, with people protecting me for reasons I can't identify. And the one person I've allowed myself to trust is someone I don't actually know anything about." The words hung between us, heavy with all the uncertainty and fear I'd been trying to ignore, while losing myself in the warmth of his presence. Kai looked away, his jaw tightening as he clearly struggled with how to respond. "You're right to be suspicious," he finally said, his voice low and strained. "You're right to question my motives and protect yourself. But Aseret, I swear to you that whatever complications exist around my position and my reasons for being here, the way I feel about you is real. The time we spend together, the conversations we have, the way you make me feel like I'm more than just the role I have to play during the day, that's all genuine." I wanted to believe him so desperately that it physically hurt. But I believed Jalen, too, had trusted that his initial kindness meant something more than it ultimately did, and I died from that mistake. I couldn't afford to make the same error again, especially not when the stakes were so much higher. "I need to know who you are," I said, pulling my hand away from his. "Not eventually, not when it's convenient. I need to know now, because I can't keep doing this. I can't keep meeting you and touching you and opening myself up to you, when I don't even know your real name or what you actually want from me." Kai's expression crumbled, pain and conflict warring across his features. "If I tell you the truth, everything will change," he said quietly. "You'll see me differently, and you'll question every moment we've shared, wondering if I was manipulating you, even when I swear I wasn't." "Then let me make that decision," I challenged, my voice harder now as fear turned to anger. "Let me decide whether I can trust you with the truth, rather than making that choice for me, by continuing to hide it." He stood abruptly, pacing a few steps away, before turning back to face me. The lamplight caught his features in a way that made him look older, more burdened, and I realized with sudden certainty that whatever he was about to tell me was going to shatter the fragile safety I'd found in our garden meetings. "My name is Kamir," he said, each word falling like a stone into still water. "I'm the Emperor." The world seemed to tilt sideways, my mind refusing to process what he'd just said, even as every detail I'd deliberately avoided noticing suddenly clicked into sharp focus. The way servants had subtly altered their paths when we were in the garden together, the depth of knowledge he had about palace operations and political maneuvering, the careful vagueness about his position that should have been a glaring red flag instead of a comfortable mystery. I'd been meeting with the Emperor, had been kissing him and touching him and sharing my honest thoughts about power and visibility and wanting to be seen, and he'd been lying to me the entire time. You lied to me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying all the betrayal I felt. Every single time we met, every conversation we had, you were lying. Not about everything, Kayamir said quickly, moving toward me with his hands raised, as if approaching a spooked animal. My feelings for you are real, Aseret. The way I listened to you, the way I cared about what you thought, and felt, none of that was performance. You let me think you were someone else, I said, standing and backing away from him. You let me believe you were safe, that this was just two people finding something genuine in a place full of calculation and politics. But you're the most powerful person in the Empire, and I'm just some provincial candidate who you've been what? Testing? Evaluating? Using as entertainment? No, Kayamir said firmly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made me believe he was telling the truth even through my anger and hurt. I wanted to know who you were without the performance, without you trying to be what you thought an emperor would want. I wanted to see the real you, the person behind all the careful strategies and defensive walls. And you thought deceiving me was the way to do that? I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. You thought lying about your identity would somehow lead to honest connection? I was wrong, he admitted, and the raw pain in his voice cut through some of my anger despite my best efforts to stay furious. I should have told you the truth sooner, should have given you the choice to continue seeing me or walk away once you knew who I really was. But I was selfish, Aseret. I was enjoying what we had too much to risk losing it. I stared at him, this man who I'd allowed myself to care about, who I'd trusted with vulnerabilities I'd sworn never to share with anyone again, and tried to reconcile the gentle lover from our garden meetings with the emperor of the entire realm who'd been deceiving me from the beginning. Was any of it real? I asked, hating how small and broken my voice sounded. The conversations, the way you listened to me talk about my family, the gentleness when I couldn't finish the sentence, the memory of his hands on my body now tainted with betrayal and doubt. All of it was real, Kayamir said, and he sounded as broken as I felt. Every word, every touch, every moment I spent with you was genuine. I'm not asking you to forgive me for lying about my identity, but please believe me when I say that everything else was true. I wanted to believe him. Despite everything, despite the lies and the manipulation and the impossibility of trust between someone with his power and someone with mine, I wanted so desperately to believe that what we'd shared had been real. But wanting something to be true didn't make it so. I'd learned that lesson already, had died from it once, and I refused to make the same mistake again. I need time, I said, my voice steadier now, as I forced myself to think clearly despite the emotional chaos. I need time to process this, to figure out what it means and whether I can ever trust you again. Kayamir nodded, his expression bleak but understanding. I'll give you all the time you need, he said quietly. But Aseret, there's something else you should know before you go. I waited, bracing myself for whatever additional revelation he was about to drop. The Empress was your sponsor, he said. Nasira is Nephira. She's been protecting you and your family from the beginning, not because she knew you personally, but because she saw in you someone who could help her challenge the traditional power structures that have kept people like her from having real political influence despite their positions. The information settled over me like another layer of betrayal, though this one was somehow less personal. I'd suspected that Nasira had ulterior motives beyond simple generosity, and learning that she was the Empress using a merchant identity to move through the capital without palace constraints actually made a strange kind of sense. Did you know? I asked. When you first approached me in the garden, did you know that your wife was my sponsor? Yes, Kayamir admitted. Nephira told me she'd chosen to back a provincial candidate who wanted autonomy rather than power. She thought you might be different from the others, less interested in preserving the existing order, and more willing to help her make changes. I was curious, so I went to see for myself what kind of person would enter this selection for reasons that had nothing to do with ambition. And what did you find? I asked bitterly. Someone naive enough to trust a stranger in a garden? Someone desperate enough to believe that intimacy could be genuine without strings attached? I found someone brave enough to be honest in a place where honesty is usually punished, Kayamir said, echoing the words he'd used before his identity had been revealed. I found someone who made me remember what it feels like to talk to another person, rather than just managing political relationships. And I found someone I care about more than I probably should, given the complications it creates. I didn't know what to say to that. I didn't trust my ability to respond without either breaking down entirely or saying something I'd regret. So instead, I simply turned and walked away, leaving Kayamir standing alone by the fountain, while I fled back to the safety of my chamber. Once inside, with the door closed behind me, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of everything that had just happened. I'd been betrayed again, had allowed myself to trust and be vulnerable, only to discover that the entire foundation of that trust had been built on lies and manipulation. The Emperor and Empress were using me for their own political purposes, The selection was apparently a tool for dismantling corrupt power networks, and I was caught in the middle of machinations I didn't fully understand and couldn't control. I pulled Nasira's scarab amulet from my pocket and stared at it, wondering if the symbol of rebirth and transformation had been a pointed message all along. Was she telling me that she knew about my reincarnation somehow? Or was it simply a reminder that this selection was meant to transform me into something I wasn't currently prepared to become? I had no answers, only questions and the hollow ache of betrayal sitting heavy in my chest. Tomorrow the selection would continue. More tests would be administered, and I would have to face both Kamir and whatever additional complications arose from tonight's revelation. But for now I was alone in my chamber, with the knowledge that every alliance I'd formed was built on deception. Every protection I'd received came with invisible strings attached, and the one person I'd allowed myself to care about had been lying to me from the very beginning. I lay down on my sleeping platform and stared at the ceiling, my mind refusing to quiet despite my exhaustion. Sleep eventually came, but it was restless and filled with dreams that mixed memories of Jalen's cold dismissal with images of Kamir's pained expression as he'd finally told me the truth. When morning came, I would have to decide whether to continue with the selection, despite knowing that I was a pawn in larger political games, or whether to withdraw and return home to face the marriage arrangement I'd been so desperate to escape. Neither option felt like freedom, but then again, perhaps I'd been naive to ever think that freedom was actually possible for someone in my position. All I could do now was survive long enough to figure out my next move, assuming I had any moves left to make that weren't already being anticipated and manipulated by forces far more powerful than myself. Chapter 6. The Cage I Chose. Morning came too soon, announced by the bell that called all candidates to gather for the day's activities. I rose mechanically, washed my face in the basin provided in my chamber, and dressed in the formal robes that marked me as a selection participant. My reflection in the bronze mirror showed someone who looked exhausted and hollow-eyed, but I suppose that was better than looking actively devastated by recent revelations. The other candidates were already assembled in the communal hall when I arrived, their conversations hushed and speculative after yesterday's dramatic expulsions. The removal of Aseret and two others had created a power vacuum in the social hierarchy, and I could see various groups already maneuvering to establish new alliances and positions. Without the clear frontrunner to orient around, everyone was reassessing their strategies and recalculating their chances. I took a seat at one of the empty tables and tried to ignore the speculative look some of the other candidates were directing at me. Word had apparently spread about my tampered ink, triggering the investigation that brought down the corruption network, and people were trying to figure out if that made me dangerous, protected, or simply lucky enough to have stumbled into significance by accident. Steward Rahemet entered the hall and called for attention, his expression as professionally neutral as always. The selection will continue with the remaining candidates, he announced, addressing the unspoken question hanging over the room. Today's evaluation will assess your capacity for strategic thinking and crisis management. You will be presented with a scenario requiring immediate decision-making under pressure, and your responses will be judged on both the quality of your choices and the reasoning you provide for those choices. He distributed sealed instructions to each candidate, and I opened mine to find a complex scenario involving a diplomatic incident that required balancing multiple competing interests while maintaining the Empire's dignity and avoiding potential conflict. The situation had no obvious correct answer, only a series of difficult choices with different consequences depending on which priorities I valued most highly. I worked through the scenario methodically, trying to focus on the task rather than the emotional chaos still churning in my chest from last night's confrontation. Strategic thinking and crisis management felt bitterly ironic, given that my personal life was currently a disaster of poor strategic choices and mismanaged crises. But I suppose that was exactly why this test was important. The palace needed people who could function effectively, even when their emotions were in turmoil. And by the time we were dismissed for the midday meal, I felt mentally drained and emotionally fragile. I picked at my food without appetite, while the other candidates chatted around me, their voices creating a background noise that I couldn't quite focus on enough to follow individual conversations. I was preparing to return to my chamber when a servant approached my table, her expression carefully professional in a way that immediately put me on alert. "You're requested in the administrative offices," she said quietly. "Steward Rahemet would like to speak with you privately." My stomach clenched with immediate anxiety about what this summons might mean, but I followed her through the palace corridors to a small meeting room I hadn't seen before. Rahemet was there as expected, but he wasn't alone. Empress Nephira sat in one of the chairs, no longer disguised as the merchant Nasira, but wearing the formal robes and jewelry that marked her imperial status. Her expression was composed, but not unkind as she watched me enter. "Please sit, Aseret," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about why you're really here and what I hope to accomplish through your presence in this selection. I moved to the indicated chair on unsteady legs, my mind racing through possible responses and strategies before settling on the realization that nothing I said or did would matter if the Empress had already decided my fate. Rahemet closed the door and took up a position near it, present but not actively participating in the conversation. You sponsored me as Nasira, I said, deciding that stating the obvious was at least a starting point for this conversation. You've been protecting my family and intervening in the selection process to ensure I wasn't eliminated by sabotage. I'm guessing you didn't do all that out of simple generosity. Nephira smiled slightly, and I recognized the same sharp intelligence I'd seen in Nasira's eyes during our initial meeting. No, I had specific reasons for choosing to back you, she confirmed. I've been watching the traditional noble families consolidate power for years, using their positions to enrich themselves while blocking any attempts at reform or meaningful change. The consort selection gave me an opportunity to disrupt those power structures by introducing someone outside their networks, someone who might actually use whatever influence they gained to help, rather than simply preserve the status quo. So I'm a tool, I said flatly, too tired and hurt to cushion the accusation with diplomatic phrasing, a convenient way for you to accomplish political objectives without having to act openly yourself. You're a partner, Nephira corrected, her tone firm but not angry. I won't pretend my motivations were purely altruistic when I decided to sponsor you. But I also genuinely believe that you have the capacity to make a difference in ways that someone from a traditional noble background never would. You've experienced powerlessness, Aseret. You understand what it means to be dismissed and erased. That perspective is valuable, and it's something the palace desperately needs. I wanted to argue with her, to point out that using me for political purposes while claiming to offer partnership was exactly the kind of manipulation I'd entered the selection to escape. But I also couldn't deny that she'd protected my family and given me opportunities I never would have accessed on my own. Whatever her motivations, the results had been tangible benefits that I couldn't dismiss just because they came with strings attached. What do you want from me? I asked, deciding that direct questions might get me closer to understanding the full scope of what I was involved in. Assuming I'm selected as consort, what exactly would you expect me to do? Nephira leaned forward slightly, her expression intent. The consort position gives you legitimate political standing and access to court proceedings in ways that I, as Empress, am often excluded from, despite my rank, she explained. The traditional power structures allow women to manage palace affairs, but not to participate directly in governance or policy decisions. A male consort, however, would have different expectations and different access. You can attend council meetings, voice opinions on legislation, and advocate for changes that I can only suggest through indirect channels. You want me to be your voice in spaces where yours isn't allowed, I said, finally understanding the full picture of what she'd been planning. You're using the selection to create a position that gives you political influence you're currently denied because of your gender. Yes, Nephira confirmed without hesitation or apology. And in return, you get safety, autonomy, and the visibility you came here seeking. Your family receives imperial protection and support. You gain influence and the ability to make choices that matter. It's not freedom in the absolute sense, but it's far more than you would have had if you'd simply accepted the marriage arrangement your parents negotiated. I sat back in my chair, processing this proposal and trying to identify all the ways it could go wrong. What about the Emperor? I found the question harder to voice than I'd expected. Does he know about this arrangement? Is he part of this plan? Or is he just someone you've convinced to go along with your political maneuvering? Nephira's expression softened slightly, and I saw something that looked almost like sympathy cross her features. Tamir and I have a complex relationship, she said carefully. We respect each other and work well together when it comes to governing the empire, but we don't have the kind of romantic partnership that traditional marriages are supposed to involve. He knows about my political objectives and supports them because he agrees that the current power structures need to change. What he does in his personal life is his own concern, and I don't interfere as long as it doesn't create problems for the empire. So you knew he was meeting me in the gardens, I said, understanding now why she'd seemed unsurprised when Kamir had mentioned telling me the truth about both their identities. You knew he was developing feelings for me, and you allowed it to continue because it served your purposes to have the Emperor personally invested in my success. I knew, Nephira acknowledged. But Aseret, I promise you that Kamir's feelings for you are genuine. Whatever you might think about how your relationship started or the deceptions involved, he cares about you in ways that go beyond political convenience. I've known him long enough to recognize when he is genuine, plus all he does is talk about you. What he feels for you is real. I didn't know if I believed her, didn't know if I could trust anything anyone in this palace told me anymore. But I also recognized that I was being offered something significant, A partnership that came with genuine opportunities to make the kind of changes I'd only dreamed about during my previous life's slow suffocation in the House of Akum. What happens if I say no? I asked, needing to know what my actual options were. If I refuse to be part of this arrangement and withdraw from the selection, what happens to me and my family? Nephira was quiet for a moment, and I could see her weighing how honest to be in her response. If you withdraw now, you'll return home and likely proceed with the marriage arrangement to the House of Akum, she said finally. I would continue to provide some protection for your family's holding, because I don't punish people for making choices I disagree with. But you would lose the opportunity to escape that marriage and the visibility you came here seeking. As for what happens to you personally in that marriage, that would be up to fate. I did know what would happen if I went back to Jalen. I had already lived through it once, and it cost me everything. The thought of returning to that life made something in my chest tighten with a panic that felt like drowning. And if I agree to this partnership? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. What does that actually look like? Tomorrow the final selection results will be announced, Nephira said, her voice shifting into a more businesslike tone. You'll be named as the Imperial Consort, the first male to hold that position in our empire's history. Your rank will be explicitly below mine in the formal hierarchy, but you'll have legitimate standing to participate in court proceedings and advocate for policy changes. You'll live in the palace, attend council meetings when appropriate, and use whatever influence you gain to support reforms that benefit people who currently have no voice in how the empire is governed. And in exchange, my family receives permanent imperial protection. I maintain autonomy over my own choices, and I never have to return to the life I was running from. I summarized, laying out the terms as I understood them. Yes, Nephira confirmed. It's not the fairy tale version of freedom where you get to do whatever you want without consequences or constraints. But it's real power, real influence, and real protection in a world where those things are rarely offered to people from your background. The question is whether you're willing to accept the costs that come with those benefits. I thought about Kamer's hands on my skin, the way he'd listened to me talk about wanting to be visible, the gentleness he'd shown, even while lying about his identity. I thought about the Empress telling me I was braver than I gave myself credit for, and the way she'd taken a risk on a provincial boy with no connections this opportunity. I thought about my parents working their modest holding and hoping their son's marriage alliance would bring security they'd never been able to achieve on their own. I thought about dying alone in a beautiful room with silent birds, while my husband attended to other priorities, the slow erosion of self that had characterized my previous life's ending. And I thought about the scarab amulet sitting on my writing desk, a symbol of rebirth and transformation, a reminder that I'd been given a second chance to make different choices, even if those choices came with complications I hadn't anticipated. I'll do it, I said, the words feeling both inevitable and terrifying. I'll accept the consort position and work with you to accomplish your political objectives. But I need you to promise me something in return. Nephira raised an eyebrow, clearly not accustomed to having conditions placed on agreements she proposed. What do you want? She asked. Honesty, I said firmly. No more deceptions, no more using false identities or hiding your real intentions. If we're going to be partners in this, I need to know that you'll tell me the truth, even when it's uncomfortable or complicated. I've been lied to enough for one lifetime, and I won't accept that as the foundation for whatever we're building here. Nephira studied me for a long moment, and I saw something like respect flicker across her features. I can agree to that, she said finally. From this point forward, I'll be honest with you about my objectives and my methods. I won't promise that everything will be comfortable or easy, but I will promise that you'll know what you're walking into before you're asked to take action. I nodded, feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified by the commitment I'd just made. Then we have an agreement, I said. Nephira stood and I rose as well, recognizing that our meeting was concluding. The formal announcement will be tomorrow morning, she said. Between now and then, I suggest you prepare yourself for the public reaction. Not everyone will be pleased by the selection of a provincial baron's son as Imperial Consort. And you'll need to develop a thick skin quickly if you want to survive the political backlash. I understand, I replied, though I suspected I had no real idea what I was about to face. Rahamet opened the door, and I left the meeting room with my mind spinning through implications and consequences. I'd agreed to become a political tool in exchange for safety and influence. Had accepted a partnership built on mutual benefit rather than genuine affection or trust, and had committed myself to a path that would require me to navigate power structures I barely understood. But at least this time, the choice had been mine. At least this time, I'd walked into the cage with my eyes open, rather than being deceived. I returned to my chamber, and found the scarab amulet still sitting on my writing desk, where I'd left it. I picked it up, and turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of both the physical object and the symbolic meaning it carried. Rebirth and transformation. Maybe that's what I was doing, transforming into someone who can thrive in the palace's complex political landscape. Evening came, and I found myself walking to the garden subconsciously, my feet carrying me to the fountain where I'd met Kamer so many times before. Part of me hoped he wouldn't be there, that I could avoid the confrontation and the complicated emotions that came with seeing him again after learning the truth. But a larger part of me needed to see him, needed to have the conversation we'd left unfinished when I'd fled the night before. He was there waiting, sitting on the fountain's edge with his shoulders hunched and his expression distant. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and I saw relief and apprehension war across his features as he realized I'd actually come. Aseret, he said, standing quickly. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me again after everything I told you. I wasn't sure either, I admitted, stopping a few feet away from him and maintaining the distance deliberately. But Nephira explained your arrangement today, and I agreed to accept the consort position. So I suppose we need to figure out what that means for whatever this is between us. Kamer's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for me to track them all, finally settling on something that looked like cautious hope. What do you want it to mean? He asked carefully. I know I hurt you by lying about my identity, and I know that trust isn't something I can just ask you to give back. But Aseret, I meant what I said about my feelings being genuine. If you're willing to give me a chance to prove that, I'll spend however long it takes showing you that what we shared was real. I wanted to believe him so desperately that it physically ached, but I'd learned the hard way that wanting something didn't make it true. And I couldn't afford to let myself be vulnerable again without some kind of protection in place. I don't know if I can trust you, I said honestly. Maybe eventually, if you're patient and if you prove through actions, rather than words, that your feelings are genuine. But right now, all I know is that you lied to me from the beginning. And that's not something I can just forgive and forget, because you tell me you're sorry. I understand, Kamer said, and the pain in his voice suggested he actually did understand the damage he'd caused. I won't push you, or try to force intimacy before you're ready. But I'm asking you to let me try, to give me the opportunity to show you that I'm more than the deception I started with. I considered his request, weighing the risks against the potential benefits, and trying to be honest with myself about what I actually wanted. The truth was that despite the betrayal and the lies, I still felt drawn to him in ways that went beyond simple physical attraction. There was something about the way he listened to me, the way he seemed to genuinely care about my thoughts and feelings, that I hadn't experienced with anyone else. We can try, I said finally, the words feeling like both a concession and a commitment. But Kamer, I need you to understand that I'm going into this with my eyes open this time. I know you're the Emperor. I know Nephira is using me for political purposes, and I know that nothing about this situation is simple or safe. If we're going to have any kind of relationship, it has to be built on honesty, even when that honesty is uncomfortable. I can do that, Kamer promised, stepping closer but not touching me yet, giving me space to set the boundaries. From now on, I'll tell you the truth about everything that matters, even when it would be easier to hide behind comfortable lies. I looked up at him, studying his face in the moonlight, and trying to see past the royal authority to the person underneath who'd shared poetry with me and held me gently in the shadows. I'm angry at you, I said quietly, and I'm hurt by what you did. But I also care about you more than I probably should, and I don't want to lose what we had entirely just because the foundation was flawed. Then we'll rebuild the foundation, Kamer said, finally reaching out to touch my face with gentle fingers. We'll start fresh with honesty and see where that takes us. It won't be the same as what we had before, but maybe it can develop into something better. I leaned into his touch despite my better judgment, allowing myself this one moment of vulnerability while still maintaining the emotional distance I needed for self-protection. Maybe, I agreed, but you'll have to earn that trust back, and it's going to take more than pretty words and physical intimacy. I know, he said, and then he kissed me with a tenderness that felt almost desperate, as if he was trying to communicate through touch what words couldn't adequately express. I kissed him back, allowing the physical connection, talking quietly about what would happen after tomorrow's announcement, and how we might navigate the complicated reality of our relationship in the public eye. Kamer explained that our personal relationship was separate from my political partnership with Nephira, that the three of us would need to establish clear boundaries between official duties and private feelings to avoid creating conflicts that could damage the reforms we were trying to implement. It was complicated and messy, and nothing like the simple connection I'd thought we were building during our earlier meetings. But it was also honest in a way that those earlier encounters hadn't been, and I found myself appreciating the clarity, even as I mourned the loss of the comfortable illusion. When I finally returned to my chamber, in the early hours of the morning, I felt emotionally exhausted, but also strangely settled. I'd made my choices, and so far have avoided the pitfalls of my previous life. The morning of the final announcement arrived with the kind of perfect weather that seemed designed for momentous occasions. Clear skies, gentle breeze, and comfortable temperature. All remaining candidates were summoned to the palace's main courtyard, where a formal platform had been erected for the announcement ceremony. Palace officials and noble families filled the surrounding space, their expensive clothing and elaborate jewelry creating a sea of color and status symbols. I recognized several faces from my previous life's occasional visits to the capital for official functions, though none of them would have recognized me as anyone significant back then. Steward Rahemet stood at the center of the platform, his formal robes more elaborate than I'd seen him wear during the selection process. Emperor Kamir and Empress Nephira sat on elevated thrones behind him, their expressions composed and regal in a way that made them seem almost like different people from the individuals I'd come to know over the past weeks. The Imperial Consort selection has concluded, Rahemet announced, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd with practiced ease. After careful evaluation of all candidates' skills, character, and capacity to serve the Empire with dignity, a decision has been reached. He paused, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest, despite knowing what he was about to say. Knowing the outcome didn't make the actual moment any less terrifying or significant. Aseret, son of Baron Catherine, has been selected as Imperial Consort, Rahemet declared. He will hold the rank of consort below Empress Nephira in the formal hierarchy, with all the rights and responsibilities that position entails. This is the first time in our empire's history that a male has been chosen for this role, marking a significant evolution in how we understand service to the throne. The courtyard erupted in shocked murmurs and speculative conversations. I saw several noble families exchange glances that ranged from outraged to calculating, clearly trying to figure out what this unprecedented decision meant for existing power structures. A few faces, including my parents, showed genuine surprise mixed with what might have been approval, though those were definitely in the minority. I stepped forward when Rahemet gestured for me to join him on the platform, my legs somehow carrying me up the steps, despite feeling like they might give out at any moment. The weight of hundreds of eyes on me was almost physically oppressive, and I had to consciously remind myself to breathe normally and maintain my composure. Nephira rose from her throne and approached me, carrying a formal necklace that marked the consort position. She placed it around my neck with ceremonial precision, her hands steady, and her expression revealing nothing of our private conversations or political partnership. To anyone watching, this was simply the Empress conferring rank on a new palace official. But when she leaned close to adjust it, she murmured quietly enough that only I could hear. "Welcome to the family." I met her eyes briefly and saw the flash of approval there, before she stepped back and returned to her throne. Kamir remained seated throughout the ceremony, his expression neutral and appropriate for the formal occasion, though I thought I caught a hint of warmth in his eyes when our gazes met briefly. Rahemet concluded the ceremony with additional formal declarations about my new responsibilities and the expectations placed on anyone serving in the palace. The assembled crowd responded with appropriate verbal acknowledgments. After the official ceremony concluded, I was escorted to new chambers in a different wing of the palace, rooms that were significantly larger and more elaborate than the candidate quarters I'd been occupying. Servants appeared immediately to help me settle in, their professional courtesy revealing nothing of what they might personally think about my unexpected elevation. I stood in the center of my new sitting room and looked around at the painted walls, the expensive furniture, the window overlooking the palace's most prestigious gardens, and tried to process the reality of what had just happened. I was the Imperial Consort now. A soft knock on the door interrupted my thoughts, and I turned to find Nephira entering without waiting for permission. She'd changed from her ceremonial robes into something less formal, though still clearly expensive and befitting her rank. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her tone more genuine than I'd heard from her during any of our previous conversations. "Terrified," I admitted honestly, "and uncertain whether I've made a terrible mistake or the best decision of my life." "Probably both," Nephira said with a slight smile. "Most life-changing decisions are like that, simultaneously the right choice and a potential disaster, depending on how you handle the aftermath." She crossed to the window and looked out at the gardens below. "The minor houses will try to undermine you," she said matter-of-factly. "They'll spread rumors about your provincial background, question your qualifications, and do everything they can to diminish your influence before you have a chance to establish yourself. You'll need to develop a thick skin quickly and learn to ignore the noise while focusing on the actual work we need to accomplish." "What work exactly?" I asked, joining her at the window. "You've talked about reforms and changes to power structures, but I still don't fully understand what specific objectives you're working toward." Nephira turned to face me, her expression serious. "I want to open political positions to people based on competence, rather than bloodline," she explained. "I want women to have the same access to governance roles that men do. I want the lower classes to have representation in decisions that affect their lives. And I want to dismantle the corruption networks that have been draining imperial resources for generations, while the people who are supposed to be served by the nobles struggle to survive." Those are ambitious goals, I observed, feeling simultaneously inspired and overwhelmed by the scope of what she was proposing. They are, Viphyra agreed, which is why I needed a partner who wasn't invested in preserving the existing system. You've experienced powerlessness, Aseret. You know what it feels like to work to survive. That perspective will be invaluable when we're making decisions about policy and reform. I nodded slowly. When do we start? I asked. Tomorrow, Viphyra said. Today you rest and adjust to your new position. Tomorrow you attend your first council meeting and begin learning how Imperial governance actually functions. And after that, we start making changes that will probably make us both very unpopular with the people who currently benefit from the status quo. She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at me. For what it's worth, I think you made the right choice, she said quietly. Not the easy choice or the safest choice, but the right one. You're going to make a difference here, Aseret. Just don't lose yourself in the process. After she left, I sat in one of the comfortable chairs I have ever seen and tried to process everything that had happened. I'd achieved what I'd come here seeking and escaped from the marriage that would have killed me. But I'd also committed myself to political battles I barely understood, accepted a role that came with enormous expectations and constraints, and entered into a complicated relationship with an emperor of all people. That evening, Camir came to my new chambers as the sun was setting, his presence somehow both expected and surprising. We sat together near the window and talked quietly about what the future might hold, about the challenges we would face both individually and together, about the delicate balance we'd need to maintain for this to work. I don't know if I'll ever completely trust you again, I admitted at one point. I'll be as patient as you need, Camir promised, his hand finding mine in the fading light. I made mistakes in how I approached our relationship initially, but I'm committed to doing better going forward. You deserve honesty and respect, and I'll give you both, even when it's difficult or complicated. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the palace gardens slowly disappear into shadow as night fell. Eventually, Camir stood to leave, respecting the boundaries I'd established about needing space to process everything before we resumed physical intimacy. But before he reached the door, I called out to him. Camir? He turned back, his expression questioning. Thank you, I said. Sleep well, Aseret, he replied softly. Tomorrow begins a new chapter for both of us. After he left, I stood alone in my new chambers and looked out at the palace grounds spreading below me, thinking about my family, seeing their relieved and proud faces at the ceremony. And Jalen was probably still living his life of comfortable privilege, unaware of what he'd lost. I pulled the scarab amulet from my pocket and held it up to catch the lamplight, watching the blue stone gleam with captured illumination. I thought about my last clear thought in my previous life, lying alone and feverish in that beautiful room. If I had chosen differently, would it have mattered? Now I know the answer. Yes, it mattered. The choices I made shaped the life I lived. None of the choices had been easy, and I had no idea if they would ultimately lead to happiness or fulfillment or any of the things I had missed out on, but they'd been mine. Every single one of them had been a conscious decision, rather than passive acceptance of circumstances beyond my control. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could really hope for, the chance to choose their own path, even when all available paths came with difficulties and constraints. I set the scarab amulet on my new writing desk, where I could see it every day, a reminder of where I'd come from and what I'd survived. Tomorrow I would attend my first council meeting and begin the work of actually earning the position I'd been given. But tonight, I was simply Aseret, a provincial boy who'd somehow become Imperial Consort, standing in a beautiful room in the palace and feeling something I hadn't felt in either of my lives until this moment. I felt alive and excited for the future. I turned away from the window and began preparing for sleep, my mind already racing through strategies for tomorrow's council meeting and all the challenges that would come after. I climbed into my new sleeping platform and closed my eyes, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring.
Quote of the week: Hope is not the belief that everything was, is, or will be fine. It is the belief that what we do matters. Rebecca Solnit. Thank you for listening to A Second Chance, a BL short story. Hope you enjoyed this story. If you enjoyed the story or want to hear more, please like, subscribe, and comment.